Dave. And Yvonne Fuhr says we can hear Douglas's joyous laugh clearly. Love it. Mwah. Love you too, Yvonne. And so now we can get into the subject of tonight. We're at the bottom of the hour. And we'll probably go an extra half hour because of it, if that's possible. And do maintain recording. Everyone out there who's capable of doing so, record us, because we don't know if we're recording tonight. We're going to assume we are. All the backup we can get is appreciated. Record us. If you can all do so, anybody out there. And Brendan says he can hear us clearly now. Bless you, Brendan. Hugs. All right. I don't even know. I think Brendan's a dude. So Brendan. So hugs, as opposed to kisses. And all right. So those of you who didn't already know, the comic book legend Stan the Manly died Monday of this week at the age of 95 in my on-site, my own Golden Bear state of California. He was at that time convalescing or rehabilitating. I don't know which, but whatever it was, he ultimately did perish. He transpired, and that was at Cedar Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, California. Now, he was an old New York boy, but he came to spend his retirement in Los Angeles. He had a very hard time of it, and that was a nationwide deal. No matter where he was having a hard time of it. I'll get into that briefly. Just caffeinating here. I do want everyone to know that I was tripping balls the other night, and Ramon Holmes said I actually shouldn't go into this, but I really do feel obligated to do so because I do know that there were plenty of people who did understand that I was not all there on my latest transmission. What had happened, of course, was I was very depressed. There was a combination of things, Veterans Day, and of course it was also the state of California is burning down around me, literally to the point where we are choking on it here in San Francisco. And the air quality is so poor that it was code red, which means that literally you are advised to stay indoors and breathe recycled air. And so that's how bad it was. This also impacting us psychologically. It was darkness at dawn. It was midnight at noon. This was not a pleasant time and still is not. So what was going on was in terms of our dear friends, they did their best to cheer us through, and I thank them so much for that. I am glad that I pulled through, and I'm glad that everyone who noticed my chronology was a bit off. It was very similar to when I was sleep talking on air back in the early days of Revolution Radio, when I was still being treated for post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms prior to going into deep hypnosis to ultimately suppress those symptoms. And there were a few times when I was on air and I fell asleep, and I was talking on air in which I relayed various things like experiences from Australia that I was thinking of, where when we were down in Australia on our vacation, and we were in the closest thing they have to mountains over there. There's no mountains in Australia. Australia produces all kinds of great sportsmen, but they don't really produce mountaineers. And there's no mountains to practice on. They have like what are essentially hills, and they call them mountains or ranges, except of course for that wonderful heart of Australia, which is sacred to the Aborigines. They have a few other ranges of hills, and we were in one of those hills that was kind of like their equivalent of the simulacra of the Bavarian Alps or something like that. And they could just make little kind of Austrian-type villages there. And the plumbing was all broken, and I had to flush the toilets by taking buckets of water and pouring them into the toilet. I began relating that experience on air while I was essentially in my sleep, talking about flushing turds down the toilet by using a bucket of water to kind of trigger the flush mechanism via gravity. And that's essentially kind of like the space I was in on my latest transmission. I spoke, for instance, of the the shooting that took place in Parkland, and I was literally confusing the massive protests that took place in Washington this Saturday, very shortly after the Parkland massacre, with what kind of in my mind was happening even then in the aftermath of the bar and grill massacre in Thousand Oaks, California. And so there are some fairly surrealistic moments in my narrative on my latest transmission. You can look for them for your amusement and entertainment and point them out to me or anything that I've missed. I'd be happy to hear it. But going back to where we're at today with Stan Lee, it's also kind of surrealistic because Stan Lee, everything he did was supersized. Where other writers created worlds, he created a universe populated by heroes, blessed or cursed with special powers. Their conflicts, internal and external, played out across skylines and time warps, rearranged cities, destroyed planets. Their success franchises available on multiple platforms, everything aimed at becoming more eyeball battering, eardrum splattering, boundary breaking than whatever came before. When he got his start in the 1940s, during the Second World War, Stan Lee was embarrassed by his profession. The way he himself said it, the man who helped create Spider-Man and other famed superheroes, the way he said it was, I would meet someone at a party and they would ask what I did, and I would say, I'm a writer, then start to walk away. When he was pressed for more details, he would say he wrote for magazines, and if questions kept coming, finally he would say comic books, and they would walk away from him. Now, a half century later, the writer who in the 1960s, the decade I myself entered this vale of tears, spearheaded Marvel Comics' transformation into a powerhouse brand, was considered a superhero in his own right. But tragically, he needed it because later in life, at a net worth that was equal to my primary game stalker, which wasn't very much considering how many hundreds of millions of dollars went into Marvel Comics, he himself was able to finagle out of Marvel Comics $70 million, an amount, again, equal the net worth of my primary Aquino cultic gang stalker, the former chairman, executive officer of Sausage Software, born in New Zealand, who relocated to Australia. I don't name him because, of course, he claims that we're invading his privacy, even though he wants to be a public figure. But you see, for rich white boys, the laws work differently. And as a result, he can take advantage of them for now, because the world, for now, swings in his direction. And that's because the Republicans are in power, and we're at the apex, the last gasp of degenerate, heterosexual, white male supremacy. And in terms of that particular individual, he can only dream of the kind of recognition and love that Stan Lee received in his lifetime. However, because Stan Lee was considered failing in his health, perhaps even in terms of his mental acuity, he was under care provision and other people had power of attorney. So he couldn't access all the money of his net worth at all. He was crashing couches house to house, trying to sue the various people who were apparently abusing their care provision privileges and using his money while providing him access to none of it. He was suing various franchises, Marvel company as well, and would withdraw these suits because he was considered essentially unfit to carry them out without a representative or a someone with power of attorney. It was a no-win situation for him. So in the end, he died Howard Hughes style, kind of like in his own little world, without any of the, shall I say, privileges that you would think he would have had. He was a pathetic case of how a man should die, or how a man shouldn't die. And the other thing to bring up from my own particular perspective, which of course is highly rarefied and unique, this is what I can say on a personal level about Stan Lee. Having never met the man, I can say that he was Jewish, and as a Jewish person who was in, like many Jewish people, either an emigre or somehow related to emigres from continental Europe at the time of the Third Reich during the Second World War. He served as a propagandist for the American public, mobilizing them for a war that never ended against the National Socialistes. But however it permutated later, up through the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s, the one thing I can say about his National Socialistes, or Nazi villains, was no matter how incredibly different they were from historical reality, two factors stood out. In one sense, he understood them and portrayed them better than anyone else, more realistically than anyone else, and in that sense, more respectfully than anyone else, because he portrayed them as constantly referencing the Holocaust as one of their greatest achievements and one of their greatest legacies to mankind, which is how the real National Socialistes really are. So he got that, and beyond that, he portrayed them again as they really are, without any guilt over what they did, only pride. And then he even went further in his Marvel supervillain team-up between the hate-monger, who was supposed to be Adolf Hitler himself, and the Red Skull. What he said was such as to make them sympathetic characters in their own right, in their own motivations, that would be very difficult for any mere mortal to understand. These were men who acted as gods in universes they had created, and as a result, these men behaved in a manner that was more than human, exactly like the Ubermensch they had aimed to create in the era of the Second World War, and ultimately did so in Unterland. Stan Lee had them, of course, acting this out on the surface world. And the way they acted out was the way they would have acted out had they remained here. I read, as a younger person, a younger man, the adventures of the Red Skull and the Hate-Monger, and in no way, shape, or form did I find them as Nazis denigrated, disrespected, or in any way, shape, or form rendered anything less than what they were. And as a Jewish individual, for Stan Lee to have done that, he did better in honoring the Third Reich than any white trash piece of shit neo-Nazi has ever done with their denials of the Holocaust and their racism, even in the comics, specifically the Marvel supervillain team-up of the Red Skull and the Hate-Monger, Adolf Hitler himself, the Red Skull being, on the other hand, the German version of Joe Smith, a man named Johann Schmidt, an irate bellhop who had the audacity when Adolf Hitler, as the Führer of the Third Reich, entering a hotel, this bellhop was so irate, so angry with his position, his lowly status in the world, that he actually flicked off Adolf Hitler and just told him to go fuck himself. And Adolf Hitler was so impressed by his audacity that he recruited the boy right then and there to be his specialist in a terrorist campaign against the Allies, his master of unconventional warfare and state-sponsored terrorism. And therefore, the Red Skull became a reflection of the actual saboteurs who worked for National Socialist Intelligence throughout the war. And in that sense, after World War II, when they were united again, they showed them leading men who were not simply Nordic Aryan, but on their island of exile, known literally as Exile Island, a reconstituted Third Reich on an island in an undisclosed location. They had mercenaries from all over the world, of all races, working with them. This is shown in that double issue of Marvel's supervillain team-up. Asians, African Americans, mercenaries who agreed to the fascist ideology because it was separate but equal. In practice, not simply in theory. And again, for Stan Lee to have showed that, he knew the reality of the Third Reich, again, better than any neo-Nazi today claiming a sense of superiority and a sense of genocide of all races for no other reason than their own selfish insecurities. With that in mind, the part of Stan Lee no one has ever spoken to or analyzed, I did present as a reference for tonight's transmission on my Facebook timelines an illustration by the graphic artist Anthony Wynne for the Atlantic Magazine's 150th anniversary issue in November of 2007, the very year my own late and sainted sire, my father, died. Stan Lee was saying, America's a dream, a vision, a miracle based on one noble idea. The idea that people of every race and religion can live together in peace, that everyone is entitled to equal justice under the law, and that government is responsible to the governed. But an idea, despite its awesome power, can be dangerously vulnerable. It must be sheltered and guarded, nourished and protected. Few things are more tragic than the death of an idea, especially one which has been a shining beacon for the entire world. Now, that, of course, sounds a bit Reaganite, and America has never been a shining beacon to the entire world other than it being a legend in its own mind. But the part of all races living together here, this is the essence of America, and that, of course, is something that I've been emphasizing. And since I'm stranded here, and we all have to live together, we have to identify those we are struggling against who would not allow that. And that is something that I'm sure Stan Lee would have agreed with had he been of the right mind. I don't know if he was sane. I don't know whether he was senescent, might have been entering a kind of dementia for all of the horrors that happened to him. People certainly were able to legally get him classified under such diagnosis for him to have lost power of attorney. But in his younger days, he would have seen in, as he did, as was written in his own comics, now I hate that name, the proper name for them being, of course, graphic literature, as is how they're referred to in Europe or in Asia with various terms like manga or manhwa in Korea. Their illustrated literature has a long history and is respected, unlike America, where they still refer to such works as comic when there's nothing comic about them. Certainly there was nothing comic about the Red Skull or Adolf Hitler under his pseudonym, the hate monger. But in those cases, what you did have was kind of an anti-America, an America in the antimatter universe of theirs that was separate but equal, as opposed to the combined America where everyone was becoming something that was a new race, as opposed to a aggregate of separate races. So in that respect, I side on both sides with Stan Lee. I side on the side that we must maintain the races as they are in Europe and in Asia and in Africa and around the world, the globe. But in America, this is different. Aside from the Native Americans, of course, whose heritage we must do our best to protect, Americans are something new. They're not European American or African American. We can have secession, a new Africa, and, of course, a reconstituted confederacy that in certain counties the whites will dominate. We can have a secession of the Solid South into both a black and a white new nation. The majority of the rest of America, that's going to become something new outside of the Indian reservations or land that will be ceded to them if justice is truly to be made in peace with the First Nations of the original peoples. But what is left for the rest of us, mainly the big cities? A new race will emerge. Stan Lee saw that too, and he did his best to subversively promote that by having his superheroes constantly change race and eventually even change gender. That also shows we're entering not just a cosmogonate or transracial America, we're actually entering a transhuman America. That, of course, triggers all the alarms in all of you out there who are indoctrinated, brainwashed by the alternative right and the phobic Russian propaganda stream, the endless sewer of shit that makes you fear the other. Now, of course, that's inflammatory enough. Inescapably, I'm going to have to cover the politics and reality of California's fires for a period of time before we can go into the politics of our still ongoing midterms. If you think the midterms are over, you've never been more mistaken. You'd better, of course, buckle your seat for the ride. Now, California's wildfires have already burned an area larger than Rhode Island. We have 3 major firestorms burning at both of California: the Camp Fire, the Woolsey Fire, and the Hill Fires. Northern California's Camp Fire is now the most destructive and deadliest fire in the state's history. 100 people are known dead statewide. Over 300,000 people have been forced from their homes. President Trump took to Twitter to blame bad forest management, which of course I deconstructed in my latest transmission, sleep talking though I was, to point out the fact that it was proven that the federal government manages the majority of forest in the state of California. If anything, the forests are burning down under Trump's management. Governor Jerry Brown, of course, has pointed to climate change. Now, both leaders are, in a sense, promoting their political agendas. But, as is oft with the political rhetoric, reality is far more complicated. The Trump-Brown exchange originally ignored what many experts consider core reasons for fire's escalating toll: development. Humans keep sparking them, and Californians keep building in high-risk fire zones prone to the fierce winds that inevitably drive the state's most calamitous blazes. Nevertheless, there's something else going on here, which I'm going to articulate to you as I always do: Republican insurgency and arson. This is the new abnormal. Governor Jerry Brown, who I stated before several transmissions back, as a matter of fact, maybe while I was still involved with either Revolution Radio or that brief interim time with American Freedom Radio, Governor Jerry Brown had at that time said something that was pretty much this: this is the new normal. And I excoriated that attitude. Governor Jerry Brown since come to enlightenment. Governor Jerry Brown said this is not the new normal. This is the new abnormal. So he knows and is alluding to in his last days in public service anywhere, because he is going to retire onto his estate, and if he's going to be socially active at all with any kind of activism, it's going to be out of the circuit of political power and more in the personal circuit. So before he goes into that twilight of retirement. He's admitting, as did David Eisenhower prior to his leaving public service, and speaking finally, all too little, all too late, about the medical industrial complex. Governor Jerry Brown is doing his equivalent of that. This is not the new normal. This is the new abnormal. We'll get into that. In the interim, firefighters in Southern California have a brand new blaze to battle. The Sierra fire sparked up overnight. It's burning through about 20 acres east of Los Angeles County. There's some good news. The firefight there may not be as rough as with other blazes because forecasters have predicted the swirling winds that have fueled the fires will slowly begin to decrease. They should have done so today with favorable conditions lasting a couple of days. Hopefully that will help. Historically, the deadliest fire was the Griffith Park fire, which claimed the lives of 29 people in October of 1933. Until now, historically, the most destructive fire was the Tubbs fire, which destroyed 5,636 structures in October of 2017. There's a difference between these two fires. The deadly fire, the Griffith Park fire, that happened in the year that Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president of the United States. That was a fire that killed more people. That was the deadliest. Historically, the most destructive of property was the Tubbs fire of October the yesteryear, just the last months of last year, destroying close to 6,000 structures. Both of those fires have now been beaten out of the records of history by the single campfire in Butte County. Now, I kept saying it was in Camp County. Again, I was sleep talking on my latest transmission. The campfire in Butte County is so named because it began near Camp Creek Road. So it became known as the Camp Creek Fire, then simply the Campfire, as in the Campfire Firestorm. And it superseded both the Griffith Park Fire of 1933 in lethality and the Tubbs Fire of yesteryear, both in a single arson and septic conflagration. So far, officially, there have been 48 fatalities as confirmed by California administration, these unfortunate souls having been killed in the northern part of the state by the Camp Firestorm, alone making it the deadliest wildfire in California history. Said firestorm having already been declared the most destructive individual fire in California state history after having devoured the once quaint mountain town of Paradise, with the number of structures destroyed surpassing 8,800 buildings and over 15,000 still threatened, if not taken down by now. And officials fear the number will rise in both buildings and bodies as search teams comb through the rubble and ashes in the town of Paradise, which was physically wiped off the map by the campfire. As the campfire rages on, authorities continue to search tirelessly for at least 100 missing people. And it's a wait in anguish. The names of the missing cover message boards set up at shelters, evacuation centers, and churches in postings that evoke memories of the aftermath of 9/11 in Manhattan or the Wenchuan earthquake in communist China. But this is the area around Paradise, the northern California town devastated by the Camp Firestorm. The death toll from California's worst fire stands at officially 48, as some of the victims' stories begin to emerge, with hundreds of people still unaccounted for. Hundreds. There's hope and desperation as relatives, friends, and authorities are trying to find them. The Camp Firestorm ignited around 6:30 a.m. local time, Thursday, November 8th, and has since burned 130,000 acres and is only 35% contained. Over 5,600 fire personnel are working to fight the fire day and night. The course of the fire, or its cause, is still officially evaded as, quote-unquote, unknown. However, on Friday afternoon, Pacific Gas and Electric Company said that it experienced a problem with an electric line near the location where the campfire started. That's according to the Associated Press. but it'd be entirely unclear if this contributed to the start of the wildfire. If it did, it could easily have done so through human agency. Somebody could just have macheted down the line, done anything to sabotage it into the brush, where, of course, it would ignite the world aflame. We have the battle ongoing in Southern California, with the winds already feeding the campfire up north. Indeed, the man who first spotted the campfire storm said it was so windy, it was almost impossible to stand up. They've also picked up in Southern California these past few days. At least 3 have died thus far in the deadly Woolsey Fire South State that has shaken a community already reeling from the mass shooting at the country music bar last week, and it's forced 250,000 people to flee their homes, stretching from Thousand Oaks to Malibu. So we have a story of survivors amid all of the fire devastation in California. There's that subgroup of survivors, the people who lived through the terror of last week's deadly mass shooting at the Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks. In the week since the shooting at the Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks, this group of survivors has stuck together, moving in a loose band between memorials and one another's homes, holding impromptu ceremonies, and visiting the relatives of the friends they lost. And their entire leitmotif, their theme in life, the thematic for now, is we've seen things we can't unsee. Comfort comes from being with the relatively small circle who understand. 1 minute they're laughing, the next they're crying. Sometimes they sit together in silence, staring into space. Though the official number of buildings destroyed stands at 177 for Thousand Oaks alone, including historic ranches and movie sets, video from helicopters shows much more widespread damage, despite efforts to fight the fire with air tankers and helicopters. You might think that's the cutting edge of firefighting technology. It's not. I'll be getting into that sure enough. The Woolsey Fire has become one of the worst in California history already, burning about 150 square miles, including over 80% of the national parkland in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. It's just been a hellish time in California. In the past week, over 230,000 acres have burned, more area than Chicago and Boston combined. And CAL FIRE confirmed that in the past 30 days, firefighters have battled over 5,000 blazes. That, of course, is beyond abnormal. This is war. Dr. Joel N. Myers, founder and president of AccuWeather, has said, "This is a serious humanitarian as well as economic disaster for the state of California, possibly rivaling the negative impacts of the great earthquakes there. At this point, AccuWeather estimates that the total damage and economic impact of the California wildfires has already exceeded 80 billion United States dollars and will likely exceed 150 billion United States dollars and possibly reach 100 billion United States dollars by next week, based on AccuWeather forecast conditions of strong winds and very little rain, combined with very dry ground and vegetation aggravated by lack of rain and strong parched winds. If these conditions and the resulting damage persist at least partially into December, this could well turn out to be one of the United States' costliest weather and climate disasters, exceeding the damage caused by the recent major hurricanes such as Katrina, Sandy, and Harvey." There's 2 more paragraphs in his report I'm going to go through for you. I'll do them when we return. Now, I'll be back. I'm going to come back after several minutes. There's not going to be any bumper music. But Paul is welcome to talk until I return if he feels the need to fill in airtime, because I know people panic. But, as I've been saying, I was drinking a lot of tea while waiting for ourselves to stabilize. So I'm going to rush to the lavatory, and I will return. Now, I'm going to go mute, so you don't hear me grunt and groan while I maneuver myself out of my current seated position. I'll be back. No bumper music. Don't panic. Stay right there. And Paul's welcome to come on my place for a few moments till I return And then we're going to go through the last few paragraphs of the AccuWeather report because they're devastating, as I was devastated in my latest transmission prior to this one, as we were almost devastated tonight by not even being able to come on air. Team Dietrich pulled through. All of you. My blessings unto all. I'll be right back. Okay, I don't hear Paul talking, so I assume that he didn't feel the need to come on and keep you all entertained while I was relieving myself. So we'll go back to the report of Dr. Joel N. Myers, the founder and president of AccuWeather. There's two more paragraphs I wish to relate to you. I will begin now. According to Dr. Myers, he says this dramatic economic loss will cause substantial damage to California's economy, with repercussions to its annual budget potentially resulting ultimately in increased taxes. Deteriorating economic conditions brought on by the negative economic impact of the firestorms, coming on the heels of last year's losses, will stress the state's budget, possibly causing the state's credit to deteriorate, which, if it occurs, will result in lower bond ratings and higher interest rates, with the snowball effect to greater deficits and more expenses. While there's a chance for some meaningful rainfall next week, it is unlikely that we will see enough precipitation to end the fires across Southern California. There's a somewhat better chance for enough rainfall to diminish the fires in Northern California. Now, officials have stated, I am finished with the paragraphs from his report now, and I will reinforce it by, of course, bringing up the fact that officials stated in a late Monday update that they had a successful day in terms of holding the current fire perimeter line and would provide structure protection throughout the night. Now, that was the last time I checked in on the Camp Firestorm. And since they are holding the line, they've managed to create enough fire breaks to contain the beast. This is where the president could come in. Now, what makes all of this so tragic is that the real high technology to fight fires, the creation of rain artificially and for all intents and purposes practically instantly, that was something that was perfected, as I said, back in the days of the Second World War and deployed almost chronically in the Vietnam conflict and counterinsurgency. Now, it's one of the things that led to Kurt Vonnegut Jr., a man who survived the firebombing of Dresden as a Jewish American prisoner of war, who was interred by the National Socialist in a slaughterhouse in Dresden because that was the only shelter they had left for all the prisoners they had taken. And they were evacuating the civilians that they could into shelters because of the enormous assault on the civic infrastructure by the mass bombing and the generation of firestorms by the Americans and the Brits. So the end result was that Kurt Vonnegut Jr. barely survived by covering himself with his fellow prisoners' bodies as they began to choke to death and suffocate amidst all of the starvation of oxygen that was all sucked up by the firestorm that was Dresden. Because of several convergent factors, he miraculously survived and then wrote the book Slaughterhouse-5 as a fiction because no one would publish a book about the historic firebombing of Dresden, certainly not back in the day when he was a published author. He also wrote a book called Cat's Cradle. Now, that was published in 1963, the very year my late sister was born. So, to this day, in order to explain to you what inspired him to write Cat's Cradle, no one has developed a more promising method of seeding clouds than Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s big brother, Bernard Vonnegut. Bernard Vonnegut, during the war, worked alongside Vincent Schaefer and Irving Langmuir at General Electric throughout World War II in the generation of artificial rain. Now, it was publicly released in 1946 when, of course, Americans thought the war was over. But because Americans were entering toward ceasefire with the Axis powers, the formerly top-secret experiments of Kurt Vonnegut, or, excuse me, his brother Bernard Vonnegut, along with Vincent Schaefer and Irving Langmuir, obviously German immigrants, their work at General Electric became open as they were doing their early experiments on cloud seeding. Schaefer, of course, had discovered in World War II, working for the Allies, that he could seed clouds with dry ice. But Bernard Vonnegut, the author Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s older brother, realized he could do it better with silver iodide, which more closely mimics the chemical structure of water ice. So Kurt Vonnegut Jr. actually joined his big brother at General Electric a few years, taking a job as a public relations man. Heavily influenced by his brother's research, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. went on to write the book Cat's Cradle in 1963, the year my late sister was born. The novel's plot, it being science fantasy, it being essentially satire, it hinges on the invention of Ice-9, which is a seed crystal that could freeze any water it came in contact with, and it becomes a weapon of mass destruction that could only be dreamed up by someone whose brother was one of the founding fathers of cloud seeding. Now, it's come so far that by the year 2009, Chinese state media announced that 12 highways around Beijing were closing because of heavy snowfall the Chinese Communist government itself had induced through cloud seeding. So it's already open that states can create their own weather. We know that the fires are taking place on the main on federal property. We have a stunning loss. 83% of parkland in the Santa Monica Mountains has burned. All of this on Trump watch. The very man who claimed that this was all the fault of California administration, it turns out he was the same man who was in charge of all of the land in which the fires have mainly been taking place. Now, the reason that's important is not just simply a swipe at an idiot named Donald Trump. It means that as the President of the United States, he could even more easily than normal drop all the water he wanted from the sky onto what is essentially territory he's personally administering as President of these United States. It's his property. It's federal property. But he's not doing it. And yet that's where most of the fires are taking place. Why are most of the fires taking place on federal property? It's not just because an idiot is mismanaging it. It's because that's where the arsonists have full sway, following Trump's orders to generate these fires on his own territory in California. This is where the red Republican insurgency is doing the most damage, because they're generating a Soviet-style scorched earth tactic, as the Soviets did in the advance of the Third Reich, by depriving them of resources, by logistically burning everything as they retreated, so the Germans would have no resources to exploit as they advanced. The Republicans are doing that with California, depriving them of all federal property from which to extract any kind of benefit by destroying that federal property in a scorched earth policy as ordered by Vladimir Putin based on the Russian experience. All of this is what's going on in the great state of California. And all of this could be solved simply by making it rain from the skies, now that some of these fires have been contained by our great firefighters who are committing their sacrifices on the field of battle against these fires, the weapon of mass destruction, the weapon of choice deployed by the Republican insurgency under Russian sponsorship. On the civilian front, the home front, if you will, the domestic front, some fans attending the NFL, the National Football League game between the New York Giants and the San Francisco 49ers on Monday night wore masks to deal with any air quality issues. Oxygen tanks were also provided on the sidelines for the players. They needed pure oxygen to rejuvenate themselves while sucking in like biological vacuum cleaners on the field, on the gridiron, all of the soot and the particulate matter they were forced to suck in on the basis of course, playing during a firestorm. And all of this is the kind of life we're leading now in the Golden Bear state of California. An evacuation order was issued for all of Paradise, home to over 27,000 people. where many had only minutes to flee the rapidly spreading blaze. And the California fire captain, Scott McLean, said via the Associated Press that pretty much the community of Paradise is destroyed. It's that kind of devastation. The wind that was predicted came and just wiped us all out, wiped everything out. 10 search teams were working in Paradise and in surrounding communities in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Authorities called in deoxyribonucleic acid labs, DNA labs, and teams of anthropologists, people who specialize in the bones of extinct human species, to help identify victims. And that's according to the Washington Post. You might ask why they would do that. There's been some concern due to sightings of massive, giant, screaming, burning figures in the woods, that some of the bodies they find might be those of anthropological relic populations, primatoids, what you would know as Bigfoot or Sasquatch or various cryptids. Now, Captain McLean said Friday morning that the blaze had nearly quadrupled in size on Thursday night. And as that campfire grew on Thursday night of last week, evacuation orders expanded into the city of Chico, California, where over 93,000 people live. Several shelters have opened for evacuees. They're filling up all too quickly. Statewide, 150,000 remain displaced, as over 8,000 fire crews battled wildfires that have scorched 400 square miles. Out-of-state crews continue to arrive. No traffic is being allowed into the town of Paradise. At least 60 patients were evacuated from the Feather River Hospital. Local schools and universities have been closed due to the threat of the fire. Multiple road closures were in effect. Fire personnel will welcome calmer conditions for the rest of the week around the Camp Fire storm. However, a multi-day Santa Ana wind event will continue to create a dangerous situation in Southern California through midweek. This is what brings us to our shout-out so belatedly tonight. To a Grand Madame Omblism, first name spelled O-M, last name spelled B-L-I-S-S-O-M. Omblism, maintain her in your thoughts and prayers. Omblism's been a Facebook fan of mine for quite some time. She left a post on my personal friends page. You can find it if you scroll down. You can look for that at your leisure anytime. Omblism to Douglas Dietrich. She left a link to a WashingtonPost.com article by a Mr. Jason Samenow, where the whole place was in flames, residents fleeing the Camp Fire storm as it tears through California towns, evacuation routes clogged with people attempting to flee the growing blaze, and first responders expressing concern about whether they could even escape. So she mentioned the Feather River Hospital. She said, wow, the Feather River Hospital and much of Paradise, California City just burned down. I am in the hospital in the nearby town for the first time in my self-controlled life. Vertigo is a terrifying, sudden, total incapacitation, I've just found out. They say the fire might reach here. Many Paradise patients were evacuated here to the local hospital and to places in the city. Yikes. She followed this up with an entire troubles. I'm going to go through it. It's not that long. She said, after I thanked her for her conveyance of the sad information, told her she would be in my prayers for both her vertigo and her physical safety. She said people are already commenting that this is a planned attack. Good. That's exactly what it is. Then she followed up in another comment on her thread, Omblism, saying, the tyrant doctor wants to medically assault me constantly, and she regularly says I am discharged. I had to file an appeal, so they cannot discharge me until noon tomorrow. I need a place to stay while I recover. I cannot stand alone. She has a walker, other things that she has to contend with, I believe. As a matter of fact, I actually didn't cut and paste the fullness of her statement there. So she has a lot of challenges and problems that she is dealing with. And again, I ask everyone to maintain Omblism in their thoughts and prayers, because she has since, to my knowledge, become entirely uprooted and is essentially functioning as a homeless individual at the moment, if I'm not mistaken. So I do ask her to maintain communications as much as possible. She says she has a four-wheel walker. She cannot drive. All this while tens of thousands of evacuees are in fire shelters far and wide. And she just realized it was like night outside. Even though it was noon, it was midnight. Very, very cold. I noticed that myself, how cold it got, because the fire sucks so much warmth into itself. The city of San Francisco dropped in temperature, being an area by many degrees, and I had to turn, of course, my electric blankets and heating pads way up myself. Now, Mona Lee McRae, the daughter of Mr. Joel McRae, the man who was a famous actor back in the day, and of course, he was a man who was most famous in Westerns, and he was the father of Mona Lee McRae, who herself, of course, is a famous singer, and shout out to her. She offered to help Blism, asking where she is. She knows various people and places in California. And, of course, Blism brought up the fact that she was essentially rendered discharged and homeless. And, of course, apparently there was no way to provide her with any place to go. So the last message that we got from her was Blism entering the comment, "Ash falls like snow, smoke lays like fog. This is a personal and California disaster. Tens of thousands of fire refugees are here." That's the last message I got from her. Again, everyone do maintain the Lady Blism in your thoughts and prayers, and hopefully at this point she's not one of the missing. And that brings us to the monsters who brought this about. Fallbrook, California, officials have confirmed that a 34-year-old man was arrested Sunday on suspicion of starting a 5-acre fire near Fallbrook that destroyed an outbuilding and briefly threatened homes on Sunday, November 11th. That was, of course, when Trump was in Europe. That was, of course, the birthday of the United States Marine Corps. November 11th, 1775. That's when Trump tweeted out his covert orders for launching more fires. He tweeted out, while he refused to visit the graves of American servicemen in France, claiming it was raining, even while all the other leaders of Europe stood in the rain before those graves and said, "We can stand the rain since men here in this field stood before rain of bullets generations ago and fell as if those bullets of lead were drops of water from the sky that scythed their bodies down." In some places like the Battle of the Marne, 1 million men engaged in hand-to-hand combat, bayonet to bayonet, face-to-face, with all the amount of men that died all over the Western Front. An edifice so large that if we had had space travel at that time, it could have been seen, the entire connection of trench networks from space. Trump stayed in his hotel room, talking privately with Vladimir Putin, both of them evading contact with any other world leaders and speaking only to each other. Trump tweeting out his secret orders to burn California down. Happy birthday, Marines. It being November 11th. Also Veterans Day, originally Armistice Day, the end of World War I. We'll talk more about the historicity of World War I and its conclusion, hopefully in my next transmission. We don't have time for today with everything that we have to speak of in the immediate sense. But after that tweet was issued, 2 men were arrested actively trying to start more firestorms. According to the San Diego Sheriff's Department, the man arrested in connection with the Fallsbury fire that broke out in Fallbrook on Sunday, that was a brush fire started in the area of Ramona Drive and Pala Road around 12:15 in the afternoon, in the middle of broad daylight, directly after the Trump tweet came out, "Happy birthday, Marines." A deputy arrived on scene to investigate the smoke. The deputy saw a white man walking away from what appeared to be a point of origin of the fire. The man was identified as 34-year-old Brad Arands, surname spelled Arands. Functionally, a homeless veteran, United States Marine Corps, registered Republican. Arands was disheveled. His behavior was suspicious. Arands was detained until the fire was controlled and a further investigation could be conducted. That particular fire he started burned approximately 5 acres, threatened numerous homes. One outbuilding was destroyed. I'm happy to say the fire was 100% contained by about 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. There's many other fires this man has apparently set that were not so contained. Arands was arrested on suspicion of felony arson, booked at the Vista Detention Facility, where with my connections I spoke with law enforcement, found out the details I did about this man that confirmed everything I would have expected. He wasn't the only man. There's an arson suspect connected to a series of fires arrested in East County. El Cajon police arrested on an arson suspect in El Cajon early Tuesday morning. Police caught the man in the process of starting a fire in the 600 block of South Mollison Avenue. Citizen was driving down Mollison when he smelled smoke, saw a dumpster on fire up against the wall of an apartment complex. The man was trying to burn everyone alive in an apartment complex of minority families. The bypassing driver called the police. When they arrived, they caught the man in the act of setting another fire nearby, trapping the exits, all the fire exits he was setting on fire so that the people would burn alive when they tried to escape. This other fire he was setting was in the parking lot of a strip mall. He had moved so fast in another dumpster after he had set the fires he did at the apartment building. Because they were both caught in time, nobody was hurt, but the man was taken into custody, and officers recovered 3 lighters, which they said were incredibly high technology lighters, the likes of which they'd never seen, something usually issued to Special Forces military. Retained as evidence. El Cajon police have not released his name, not publicly. I don't have it either. But I do know one thing. They said the man operated as if this were a military assault and he were a demolitions expert that was taking on an enemy. Now, the reason they're not giving his name, I can tell you, because he's got military ID, active duty, and he's operating under orders. Police are willing to state officially that they've determined he's responsible for a series of fires in area. We are at war. These are Donald Trump's militiamen. They are operating in a paramilitary manner with plausible deniability, even though it's impossible to deny what they are. No one will dare make the connection that our governor is only hinting at this is the new abnormal. Trump wants you fucking dead. Get it in your head. Now, one California calamity after another. Yet we always endure. We have no hurricanes, cyclones, or statewide freezes in California. Everything else we have. Earthquakes, yes. Torrential downpours, yes. Mudslides, yes. Extended droughts, yes. A president that is trying to annihilate us, who verbally kicks us when we're down, for that which he himself be responsible for. Like an abusive father who rapes his children and then tells them what sluts they are. All that, as well as mass shootings and wind-whipped killer firestorms that devour parched vegetation, homes, people, and everything else in their path, under orders of a crazed executive, himself the puppet of a foreign dictator. A town named Paradise has been reduced to ash. Paradise lost. Over 3 dozen killed in the wine country fires. The Woolsey fire marches on West Hills and Malibu. Thousand Oaks residents went from mass killing vigils to praying that their homes would not burn down. We stand in wait of a tsunami, squadrons of locusts or volcanic eruptions, all of which are within the realm, and wonder how much more California can and must endure? The answer, unfortunately, is quite a bit, if history be a good marker. And if you consider the fact that the state is built for disaster, yet we are helpless against its charms, drawn by growing millions to a theater of calamity. The 1906 earthquake and fire that destroyed San Francisco is still a reminder that the state is always an instant away from major catastrophe. We are cracked from Eureka to Escondido, a pair of fragile plates grinding in different directions, and the southern portion of the San Andreas Fault is frighteningly overdue for a quake that could kill thousands and knock out water, power, transportation, and communications lines for months. The topography of mountain and basin teams with drought deluge cycles to invite wicked wildfires, and we're addicted to building in suspiciously unsafe places, making ourselves vulnerable to Russian insurgents under Republican nom de guerre. Per the text of a 2011 University of California exhibit on the state's history of natural disaster that I visited to draw my mind away from personal tragedy in the year that my late and sainted Cyrus died, my own mother, who died in that year of 2011, when I went to visit the California exhibit on catastrophe so I could feel better about myself not being the only person on earth suffering. From the pamphlet I was able to bring home and have before me now, from the mid-19th to the early 20th centuries, earthquakes, floods, fire, disease, other catastrophes shaped and reshaped California's natural environment and the new towns and cities growing up across the state. Before European and American development, native Californian groups altered the landscape purposefully to preserve it and avoided areas they knew to be dangerous. But by the mid-1800s, the gold rush brought a population boom that was uncontrollable. These newcomers naturally built new towns and cities around bays, harbors, rivers, mountains, and fertile valleys. But because they didn't know the landscape's history, some communities were built on top of potentially dangerous environmental factors such as floodplains and unseen earthquake faults. Some climate scientists, I'm going away from the pamphlet now onto my own observations learned from my research. Some climate scientists warn that the drought deluge cycle is tied to global warming and could intensify. Before all of California is reduced to kindling, we need to rethink how and where we build. That much is obvious. Housing developments, some of them relatively new, line the San Andreas in the Coachella Valley. And cities throughout Southern California have done little to shore up seismic safety on commercial and residential developments. Maybe the best way to show how much we love living in California is to better understand its history and respect its power. Now, returning to that text I sourced from, the 2011 UC Berkeley exhibit, here it says, surprisingly, most disaster survivors, whether displaced by flood, fire, or earthquake, did not leave or move to safer ground. Instead, people worked to rebuild and reshape their cities in the same place. They used newer and better building materials and techniques, hoping to create sturdier structures that would withstand another natural disaster. Well, I can tell you personally, going off pamphlet, they did and they didn't. And the time to rethink the planning of the landscape is before rather than after the damage is done. All over California in the last few days, we've seen stories of people offering support to those who have lost loved ones or property. We've seen firefighters and other responders risking their lives to save others. We cling to the edge of the continent, shaken by loss, too foolish to run, or too much in love. And that subject alone, the concept of love. Here's how you can help those affected by the California wildfires. Ways you can assist. Transportation. Lyft, LYFT, is offering free rides to people in the affected areas. Anyone who's listening to me who's within their realm of agency, dial 211 for assistance. Communication. Let your family know you're safe by using Facebook's safety check for the affected areas. AT&T is allowing unlimited talk, text, and data access to all customers in Southern California. Bear that in mind. Shelter. Airbnb hosts are providing free rooms in Ventura and Butte counties until November 29th. I know that much. The city of Rolling Hills Estates is accepting horses affected by the Woolsey fire. The Humane Society of Ventura County is accepting dogs, cats, horses, and other domesticated animals. And donations. Organizations are on the ground with food, water, and other relief supplies. You can donate. You don't need me to tell you where to go. All you need to do is look up the California disasters. You'll find more than enough donation opportunities. Now we cover the politics that made California such a threat that it had to come to this. The 2018 midterms are not over. The blue wave rolls slow but inexorably. Big turnout, long count. The election turnout broke records, and as the count continued, Democrats' prospects have improved markedly since my latest transmission. Across the country, from Florida to California, millions of ballots remain to be counted from an election that broke turnout records. And as the count continues, Democratic wins have mounted. California Republicans lost a 4th seat in the House on Tuesday, just yesterday, as Democrat ̵HÄ-DÍ gained enough votes to oust Republican Jeff Denham, the representative of the San Joaquin Valley. Denham's loss, projected by the Associated Press, came amid signs that 2 other Republican seats are also in growing jeopardy. Now that, of course, means California is now a Democratic supermajority. California is becoming a one-party state. For that reason, Trump wants to turn us into the new Atlantis, the second Atlantis, to drown in a sea of fire. Let me go on after I get some more of this tea. Now, Republicans in Florida and Georgia have warned ominously about the threat of vote fraud as they watched yesterday night victory margins shrink. There's been no evidence of voter fraud, of course, just the slow processing of votes from an election that nationwide has broken a century-old turnout record. According to Michael McDonald of the University of Florida, the nation's leading expert on voter turnout, at least 114 million people, that's 50% of the voting eligible population, cast ballots in this year's midterm elections nationwide. That alone would be the highest turnout in over half 100 years. And the total has gone higher yet, surpassing the level set in 1966, the very year I myself was born into this vale of tears delivered out of my fainted mother's womb, just before the voting age was lowered to age 18. And, of course, this challenges the record set in 1914, before most women had even the right to vote. In many states, that's left very large piles yet to be counted, primarily mail-in and provisional ballots. Now, there's been this Republican in the crucial runoff election in Florida that's made barbarous and sick commentary. Mississippi, of course, has a runoff election where we can, meaning us Democrats, can pick up a U.S. Senate seat in but a fortnight, meaning 14 nights, or a 2-week period. Mississippi be a red state, and Republicans are not used to having to run a competitive race. However, Democrat Mike Espy, an African-American, can win, similar to how Doug Jones won in Alabama last year. In fact, Mississippi is actually quite a bit bluer than Alabama. But oh, the laughs never stop in Mississippi when it comes to jokes about lynching. At a comparatively recent campaign event known as Mississippi's Giant House, the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, it's an annual gathering where hundreds of extended families live in brightly painted cabins for over a week, and among the featured events are 2 days of political speaking. 'Twas in that social context, on Thursday, July 27th of yesteryear, 2017, that Republican Senate candidate Cindy Hyde-Smith made a deeply offensive joke about lynching, saying of her black opponent, Democrat Mike Espy, that if he invited me to a public hanging, I'd be on the front row. That's Mississippi's Republican Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith for you, who's facing now a runoff election against Democrat Mike Espy, again, an African-American. And on November 27th, when this runoff election takes place, This is happening because neither candidate got 50% of the vote on Election Day. Mr. Espy, he called Hyde-Smith's comment reprehensible, and the president of the National Association of Advancement for Colored Peoples, the NAACP, as you would expect, said that Hyde-Smith's decision to joke about hanging when the history of African Americans is marred by countless incidents of this is a barbarous act in and of itself. It's sick. Personally, I would say giving Mississippi's history of lynching, calling the representative Hyde-Smith's comment simply sick is all too generous. As for Hyde-Smith, she's responded in this runoff that her remark was an exaggerated expression of regard, whatever that means. Most certainly, it means low regard for them uppity-start niggers. And in Florida, Rick Scott won't commit to certifying recount results while he loses, the recount being legally required. Republican Governor Rick Scott's senior campaign advisor, Brad Todd, has repeatedly refused to commit to certifying the results of Florida's United States Senate election if Scott ends up losing in a recount to Democrat Bill Nelson. The results of the recount won't be known until after it ends on Thursday of this week. Todd's comments leave open the possibility that Nelson wins, but Scott has repeatedly insisted he is the winner, regardless of what happens with a recount. Scott's already shown a willingness to exploit his current office for political gain. During a news conference held from the governor's mansion last Thursday evening, Scott called for state law enforcement agencies to investigate election officials in 2 Democratic-leaning counties that took longer than others to tally their ballots. Sans providing any evidence for his claims, Scott insisted, "I will not sit idly by while unethical liberals try to steal this election from the great people of Florida. Their goal is to keep mysteriously finding votes until the election turns out the way they want. Left-wing activists having been coming up with more and more ballots out of nowhere." Although Florida law enforcement and elections officials have repeatedly indicated they've seen no evidence whatsoever of fraud, Scott and other prominent Republicans continue to baselessly claim Nelson and his attorneys are trying to, quote-unquote, steal the election through a recount process that was required by Florida law. Scott's evidence-free howls about election fraud have been echoed by President Trump himself, of course. On Tuesday, Trump suggested Democrats in Broward and Palm Beach counties are fabricating ballots. Again, there being no reason to presume they'd be doing so. A number of groups have called on Scott to recuse himself from the recount process due to his obvious conflict of interest, but he's refused. The Florida Democratic Party released a statement comparing his behavior with Latin American dictators who have overthrown democracies in both Venezuela and Cuba, concluding that the governor is using his position to consolidate power by cutting at the very core of our democracy. Now, marching through Georgia, it's more than a week after Election Day, and there's still controversy surrounding Georgia's governor's race. Although Republican Brian Kemp has declared himself the winner, Democrat Stacey Abrams, an African-American female, is not giving up. Black woman, Democrat Stacey Adams, has not conceded against her opponent, Brian Kemp. Stacey Adams takes more of Brian Kemp's lead in Georgia's governor's race with every passing day. Her campaign has held a few news conferences to talk about the problems voters had with the election. The campaign is very critical of Georgia's voting system and filed a variety of lawsuits that have led to more votes being counted and raised questions about the intrinsic corruption of the system as rigged towards Republican advantage. So federal judges have ordered review of all provisional ballots in Georgia, delaying deadline for certification. The issue being whether Republican Brian Kemp has had enough votes to avoid a runoff against the Black American woman and a Democrat, Stacey Abrams. For a recount, there has to be a 1% margin between candidates. Currently, Kemp is leading Abrams with a 1.46% margin. Kemp had about a 63,000 vote lead over Abrams, but state law requires a runoff if no candidate gets over 50%. Because of a third-party candidate, Kemp is barely above that line currently, and the Secretary of State's office is showing new numbers for the governor's race. The race is still tight, but the additional votes still don't yet push this highly contested battle into a runoff, but Abrams' campaign officials know that as final ballots are counted, Kemp will drop below 50%. Kemp needs 50% plus one vote to avoid a runoff. If either candidate fails to get more than half of all votes cast, the two candidates will compete in the runoff. The same is true for any state race that winds up in a runoff. So here's the breakdown from the Secretary of State's office website that I sourced. Kemp has 1,977 and 502 votes, which equals about 50.24%, 50 and a quarter of 1% of a vote. That's slightly down from the 50.28% he had on Monday this week. Abrams has 1,921,680 votes, which equals 48.82%. And the Libertarian in the race, Ted Metz, has less than 1% of the votes. Finally, in Arizona, over 400,000 ballots remain, about 1 in 6 of the statewide vote. On Thursday last week, Democrat Representative Kyrsten Sinema, S-I-N-E-M-A, took a lead of about 9,000 votes over Republican Representative Martha McSally in the race for United States Senate. Kyrsten Sinema's victory in Arizona may be the Democrats' biggest win of the Trump era. Sinema's triumph sets the stage for a debate inside the Democratic Party about how to win red states in 2020 and beyond. Republican losers, of course, have sued newly elected legislators, particularly the Latina, a female by the name of ̔HɁ Terán, claiming she wasn't born in the United States when she very definitely was. So, to give you an example of how the Republicans claim all Democrats are sore losers, but sue whenever they lose, a failed Republican candidate for office has sued, again, a newly elected Democratic state legislator, claiming, sans any evidence, that the United States-born Latina ̔Hǳ Terán, who won her seat to the Arizona House of Representatives last week, isn't a United States citizen. Now, I found this out on Facebook. Terán wrote in her Facebook post, "Just now I was sitting at home with Eddie and EJ, putting the finishing touches on our thank you email. My doorbell rang, and guess what? I've just been served. A lawsuit has been filed challenging my citizenship. I now must appear in court next week." This is actually the second time that Alice Novoa, a perennial Republican candidate and conspiracy theorist who ran for state secretary of state this year, that's according to Arizona Central. I've gone into this in terms of my own research. This is the second time that this lady, Alice Novoa, obviously not a lady at all, has sued this Latina Terán. Novoa also sued in 2012 when Terán unsuccessfully ran for state office. Now, according to court records I've sourced, that lawsuit was swiftly dismissed, and Terán's attorney provided a copy of her birth certificate. So this Novoa bitch is a racist and a moocher to boot. In both cases, she hasn't paid any filing fees. She requested her fees be waived because she claims she doesn't work and has no income. Because like most white trash pieces of shit, guess what? The overwhelming recipients of welfare are white, and she's one of them. The court, because she's a welfare recipient, has waived or deferred over $650 United States dollars between the two cases. Now, Novoa's birther lawsuit is a waste of the court's time and the public's resources. I can't understand why a judge can't punish her already, but Terán, the Latina she's suing, is being vocal in fighting it, saying that if I don't defend myself as aggressively as I can, then this ugly tactic will be used on somebody else. Clearly, when a racist president has spent years spreading birtherism, others, like Novoa, feel emboldened to carry on the tiki torch as well. With Novoa also targeting Terán for years by now, the state should also make sure that Terán can perform her work in public service in safety with a security task force to investigate this. I relate to this because this Novoa is obviously a gang stalker. She's obviously assigned. She's obviously being paid to do what she's doing. Now, to quote Tehran in her response, the Latina legislator is saying, we know that we can just go to court and have this frivolous lawsuit thrown out, but it's better to speak out. I will not be intimidated by this harassment and really this psychological warfare designed to exclude people like myself on basis ethnicity alone, when our citizenship is incontestable. Well, stand in line, honey, because that's the same thing people always claim about myself, that I should be deported to, of all places, communist China, and that they think of myself as a quote-unquote communist Chinese agent. Because anyone who's not a member of the white trash alternative right, or one of their cocksucking coons or ass-rimming bitches, must be some fucking Asian spy. And, of course, psychological warfare, 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, is the practice of mind war. That's Mind War in Practice, as co-authored by two Temple of Set cultists, Michael Aquino and General Paul Vallely, the man who founded ISIS. Now, before the 2020 presidential campaign begins in earnest, what have we learned amidst all this nonstop mind war? Well, for starters, it's too late to worry about 2020 because the next campaign is well underway. It's 2020 now. President Donald Trump filed for re-election the day he was inaugurated, and his campaign has already raised $100 million United States dollars and begun airing televisual and digital ads. So it should be no surprise that Trump campaigned more aggressively than any other modern president during the election midway through his term. He drew thousands of supporters to huge rallies where he talked more about himself than the candidates he was there to boost. Some were in states crucial for his re-election prospects. On Monday of this week, he closed the campaign with events in Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri, and he officially announced his 2020 slogan, Keep America Great, KAG, or CAG. For Democratic presidential hopefuls, the campaign was an opportunity to audition. A stream of potential contenders managed to make their way to Iowa, the state that was set to opening presidential caucuses in 15 months or so. Senators Cory Booker of New Jersey, Kamala Harris of California, Bernie Sanders of Vermont, plus Governor Steve Bullock of Montana, John Hickenlooper of Colorado, and Jay Inslee of Washington State, and Representatives Eric Swalwell of California, John Delaney of Maryland, even Stormy Daniels' attorney, Michael Avenatti. Now, what did all these people learn from the midterms? First, that Trump rules the Republicans, totally and without question. Himself, Trump, a former Democrat, who had never run for political office before his unlikely campaign 2 years ago, is now the face, the heart, and soul. Well, wait, there's no heart and there's no soul, so all we're left with is the fucking face, or rather the ass, the butt that looks like a face, of the Republican Party, defining its tenets, reshaping its coalition. The midterm elections underscored how completely Trump commands the Republican Party. Outsider Trump-like contenders upset establishment favorites for the gubernatorial nominations in Florida and Kansas. The senators most likely to criticize them, Bob Corker of Tennessee and Jeff Flake of Arizona, decided not to run again. The Republicans on the ballot who openly distanced themselves from the president could be counted on one hand, and not using all five fingers, mind you. One of the few Republican House incumbents who did challenge Trump, Carlos Curbelo of Florida, lost his bid for re-election. Of course. The White House was quick to take credit for Republican gains in the Senate. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said in an interview on Fox News, the main propaganda outlet for Trump cult and Republicans, said, frankly, the candidates who have embraced the president and the president has gone into campaign for over the last several weeks are candidates that we see doing very well tonight. She said this, of course, on the midterm night of last Tuesday. The president unified the party and brought it together. So Trump's, or I'm sorry, I keep thinking primping, or prumping, like, you know, pumping. So it comes out as prump to me. I'm sinicizing it. Trump's primacy is unchallenged with the Republicans, even though he publicly castigated such Republican allies as House Speaker Paul Ryan and privately alarmed top party officials with divisive rhetoric. Many urged him to focus on the strength of the economy. Instead, the president's closing message trumpeted dire and unsubstantiated warnings about the threat from illegal immigration. Now, Lawrence Jacobs, the director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota, observed that what's surprising to me is how sustained and intensified the support is for Donald Trump. The much predicated fall of Donald Trump as a candidate and as a political figure has not been the case among Republicans. If anything, he's picked up a more intense following. Now, 2/3 of voters in the exit poll said the president affected their vote. About 1 in 4 to show their support for him, about 4 in 10 to show their opposition. But Trump, love him or loathe him, defined the 2018 midterms election, as he did in 2016 with the help of foreign dictatorship and the hacking of the legal electoral process, and as he surely will in 2020 in what will hopefully be his crash and burn. Now, some Democrats saw the midterms as a testing ground for a more assertively liberal message by the party's 2020 standard bearer, whoever it turns out to be. Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, sometimes mentioned as a presidential possibility, told cheering supporters at his re-election victory party Tuesday night, "You showed the country that progressives can win and win decisively in the heartland, and you showed the country by putting people first and by honoring the dignity of work. We carry a state that Donald Trump won by almost double digits." And this presents a dangerous electoral map for Donald Trump. Voters swung heavily towards the Democrats this year, and that poses a big challenge for Trump as he looks towards re-election. Were electoral votes distributed based on which party prevailed last Tuesday, a Democrat would win the presidential contest on the midterms map of this year with 278 electoral votes, 8 more than needed for victory, plus 219 for the Republican and 41 toss-ups. The midterm elections revealed that America is in a cold but very active, proactive civil war. This is a country fundamentally split in two, with no room for compromise. Let me deconstruct the strange argument that Democrats actually lost the midterms, that all your asshole friends will tell you on Facebook or on YouTube, because both venues are dominated by the Zuckerman cult of Republican white trash. We know that Mark Zuckerberg personally called up Donald Trump to congratulate him when Vladimir Putin hacked him into power. So we know where Zuck lies in his political leanings, and they are elitist. They are white supremacist. To him, other colors don't exist. As a Jew, he considers himself white by dint of wealth. Now, to get away from his influence and his fan fiction, let's get into reality after I have myself another sip of tea here to keep myself hydrated. You might think that Democrats winning the House in Tuesday's midterm election, which gives them tremendous power to obstruct and investigate Donald Trump, should count as a major victory for the anti-Trump resistance. But the emerging so-called conventional wisdom among Beltway centrists is the opposite, that Democrats overreached, taking too far to the left, and ending up with mediocre at best result. Now, the New York Times' Nick Kristof, a center-left columnist, I'm going to quote him. He wrote, "Don't listen to Democrats who portray these midterms as an important triumph. In 2016 and again this year, liberals listen too much to one another and not enough to the country as a whole." Now, Brett Steffens, Kristof's fellow columnist on the center-right, wrote the day after Kristof, "The result of the midterms means, if nothing else, that the president survived his first major political test more than adequately. Unless Democrats change, he should be seen as the odds-on favorite to win in 2020. Now, these two columns, which I reviewed myself, and several similar ones published in recent days, follow basically the same script as issued by the White House press corps. They argue that the most progressive parts of the Democratic Party are to blame for the party's allegedly weak performance in the midterms. On this argument, Democrats would have won big if they hadn't nominated progressives like Beto O'Rourke in Texas, or if they hadn't gone all in against Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. But that narrative rests on a faulty premise because, factually, the 2018 midterm elections were a significant victory for the Democratic Party. Retaking the House blocks the Republicans from passing new laws and gives Democrats the ability to conduct real investigations into President Donald Trump's multifarious scandals. But while the immediate post-election battle may be in the House of Representatives, the midterms also revealed that the war for the soul of America is only just getting started. And so am I. Now, we've got at least 2 hours ahead of us. Now, I'm going to finish what I started tonight because we started so late. So because of that, our friend Paul up there in Canada and the rest of you might be here a little late into your night. We're going to see what he can stand. I'm going to try not to inconvenience him, and I'm going to try to go through our regular time slot. I'm going to take a break, go mute, inhale some more tea to make certain I can go through the next 2 hours. And in the meantime, I'm going to be right back on mute. Not going to wait. Don't panic.
Wherever I go, I don't think they like my haircut. I don't think they like my clothes. I can't wait to get back to New York City, or at least when I walk down the street, no one ever hesitates to tell me exactly what they think of me. There was snow on the road. I parked in an empty lot where there was no one else around. But I guess I was taking up too much space.
I got that out of the way. That was inhaling tea, mind you, not going to void my bladder. I'm not that old yet, so I can last a long time before having to relieve myself, thank God. That means I can sleep all night without getting up. So let's see any of the elderly do that. Anyhow, the preliminary results revealed the divides that determined the 2016 election are intensifying and strengthening. Republicans did well with rural voters, white Southerner voters, and low-educated voters. In other words, if you're white trash countryside out there fucking your sister and never got a day's education in your life and you can't read or write, you write an X in the box or punch through a chat or do something electronically with the pen that they give you, kind of like the stuff you sign for when you get your stuff in the mail through, FedEx or UPS or something like that. Like the lingerie you ordered for your sister or your mother before fucking her. And the teddy or the nightgown you stuffed them in before you produced more half-breeds or all too inbred kids. And then you vote Republican. Well, Democrats won among city dwellers, minorities, and highly educated white suburbanites. The strength of these divides have led to some consequential results, like Republicans sweeping victory in the Missouri Senate elections, as we've seen them until, of course, they've been challenged, or the Democratic biggest upset of the night in an Oklahoma House race. The results make clear that American politics is polarized, not on the basis of class or even ideology, but on identity politics. The United States is currently split into two camps. One side open to mass immigration and changes to the nation's traditional racial hierarchy. The other is deeply hostile to such advances, such progress. Trump and the congressional Republicans did their best to exploit these divides. Remember the caravan. And the best political science we have today suggests that such divides exist between Americans who live in different places and socialize with completely different people. This is a long-standing divide in America. It's one that accelerated under President Barack Hussein Obama as an African-American administering American empire. But President Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, based on Russian sponsorship, became based on the fact that Russia is an all-white, white trash. It's the world's only all-white, white trash empire. They made certain that their puppet president, or president-elect, or president-hack, their president-select, made this the most racially divisive campaign in modern recorded history that since escalated into cold civil war. Everything thus far, inclusive bullets and bombs, but not yet on a level where forces are deployed in the field. Trump's victory was a political Fort Sumter, a sign that smaller and more racially regressive parts of this nation, the white heterosexual elite, would never accept social change without going down in flames. The midterm elections have revealed that this fight's here to stay, at least as long as Trump is in the White House. We are locked in cold civil war. Now, why did the 2018 midterms end the way they did? Race and identity. How do we make sense of these divides? To answer that question, I myself sourced George Washington University political scientist John Sidis, or Sides, S-I-D-E-S is his surname. He's the author, along with UCLA, or the University of California at Los Angeles' Lynn Vavrek, and UC Irvine's Michael Tesler, his co-author and co-authoress, of a book entitled Identity Crisis, the best book for my money on the 2016 presidential election. Sides, the author, S-I-D-E-S, I'm going to call him Sidis so that we differentiate that. Sidis sees the demographic splits as representing fundamentally an extension of the battle over identity issues that defined the 2016 election. Sidis tells us, I quote his T, the factors that divided the electorate in 2016 are dividing them even further now. One example is the education divide within whites, which appears as large, if not larger, among women. Another example is the rural-urban divide. All of these demographic characteristics are correlated with views of race and immigration. To understand why Sidis sees the Tuesday night of last week as reflecting a divide on these issues, we need to go back in time to the beginning of the Obama presidency. American politics before Obama were already quite racialized. The civil rights movement had a tectonic effect on the American political landscape, sorting black voters into the Democratic Party and pushing racially reactionary white Southerners to defect to the Republicans. Mass Hispanic immigration had a similar effect. Democrats' friendliness to continued immigration and growing Republican skepticism of the same further polarized the electorate on racial lines. Obama's victory, the visible symbol of a changing America that no voter could ignore, took all of these latent divides and turbocharged them. The result, Sidis et alia, meaning Sidis and others, they argue in their book, Identity Crisis. The result was a collapse in Democratic support among white voters without college education. In other words, the stupid motherfuckers who can't read or write. And I say motherfuckers literally, like these are people who rape their mom when she's bending over and then just not prepared, not looking in. And these kids have been staring at her ass all their life and decide to go for it. Anyhow, Sidis et alia, they write, whites who did not attend college were evenly split between two parties in Pew surveys conducted from 1992 to 2008. By 2015, white voters who had a high school degree or less were 24 percentage points more Republican than Democratic. The exact stats being 57% to 33%. That's a lot, at least a quarter. This isn't a class divide in the traditional sense, mind you. There are plenty of relatively high-income whites without college degrees. Think of a successful self-employed plumber, for instance. Rather, the diploma gap tracked measures of racism and racial resentment more so than anything else. Democrats lost huge amounts of ground among non-college whites with reactionary racial attitudes, while staying the same or even improving among those whites with more progressive views. Now, Sidis, Lynn Vavreck, and Michael Tesler, these are the three co-authors and authoresses who have presented similar evidence on the effect of immigration in recent years in their book, White Backlash. White Backlash is another book separate from Identity Crisis, and in that book, they have consulted with political scientists Marisa Abrahano and Zoltan Hajnal, who have found that mass immigration and media attention to the threats from immigration, like unauthorized immigrants committing crimes, has led to rising white sorting into the Republican Party. Now, the book, titled White Backlash, is writ in consultation with the three other authors and authoresses who wrote the book I've already cited that I also recommend, Identity Crisis. But it's a separate book that's credited to an author and authoress, or co-author and co-authoress, named Marisa Abrahano and Zoltan Hajnal, entitled White Backlash. That's also equally recommended. Both of these are inseparable, and they're cross-referenced. White Backlash, the authoress's surname is Abrajano, Abrahano. The author's surname is Hajnal, Hajnal. Abrahano and Hajnal write, I will quote them now from the book before me, when media coverage of immigration uses the Latino threat narrative, the likelihood of whites identifying with the Democratic Party decreases and the probability of favoring Republicans increases. As immigration's impact on the United States has grown, whites have fled the Republican Party in ever larger numbers. That means whites with education or any sense of humanity, decency, heart, and their soul. Donald Trump won the presidency by Russian hacking, but he won the popular appeal to the white trash sewer of shit by appealing nakedly to these divisions. His rhetoric on Mexican immigration, Muslims, and African Americans appealed to the kind of low-educated or no-educated countryside white trash voters who had fled the Democratic Party, while it turned off more educated voters who tend to have more racially progressive views. The effect wasn't large enough for 2016 Democratic challenger Hillary Clinton in a few key areas. The 2018 midterms represent an extension of this battle. Democrats campaigned on bread and butter issues like health care, while Trump's outsized media presence and insistence on his issues, like the so-called migrant caravan, practically ensured that the debate would be a referendum on Trump's brand of politics of resentment. The Trump strategy was to continue polarizing the electorate along identity lines and to hope for a repeat of 2016. Now, this worked to a degree. Republicans who ran Trump-like campaigns on identity issues, like Ron DeSantis in the Florida governor's race, which we're still unsure on, mind you, in terms of its ultimate outcome, were rewarded, at least initially, by the rural and non-college right electorate, the countryside ignoramuses, the pridefully ignorant, the idiots. It also helped defend some Republican House seats in the South, where statistical studies suggest racial identity issues are particularly important, if not decisive, all-inclusive for white voters. But this time, the Democratic dominance among minority voters and gains among more educated whites more than offset those losses. Democrats even managed to claw back some of Trump's gains in Midwestern states like Wisconsin and Michigan that were billed as the archetypal places for blue-collar Trumpism to succeed. The president's identity politics helped him consolidate his base, but it also cost him a fair number of voters, enough to lose the House of Representatives. We're seeing the emotionally charged politics of race and immigration emerge in lots of states and districts, even without Trump on the ballot. What the midterm results reveal is that the demographic divides that determined the 2016 presidential election are intensifying and strengthening in reinforcement to the level of open warfare. Republicans did well with countryside bumpkins, the rural voters, white Southerner voters, the Klansmen, and low-educated voters, the idiots, while Democrats won among city dwellers, minorities, and highly educated white suburbanites. The strength of these divides has led to some consequential results already, like Josh Hawley's defeat of Claire McCaskill elections, or the Democratic biggest upset of the night in the Oklahoma House race. The results make clear that American politics is polarized, not on the basis of class or even ideology, but on identity. So, when I myself go over the factors that divided the electorate in 2016, I can confirm unto you it's dividing them even further now. Now, one example is the education divide within whites, which appears as large, if not larger, among women, as I've said. And then there's the city-country divide that presaged and characterized the Chinese Civil War on the mainland between the nationalists and the communists. Only in the United States, all of these democratic characteristics are correlated with views of race and immigration. Now, some individual candidates defied the overall trend. Tester and Manchin, in particular, succeeded despite the shift towards identity politics rather than because of it. But on the whole, they're the exceptions that prove the rule. This election was a candidate's fate being set by demographics and identity. This new divide has almost nothing to do with ideology as traditionally conceived to this point in history, but rather over what Democrats and Republicans want this country to look like in the immediate future and for all the centuries to come as America enters its third century as a constitutional entity. Now, is increasing diversity a good or bad thing? Are movements like Black Lives Matter about helping minorities or hurting whites? Is immigration a threat to the American project or the source of its strength? These questions are increasingly bound up in other kinds of identities like religion and urban versus rural, city versus countryside, with partisan identity serving as a kind of cultural catch-all. Specific policy stances are comparatively less important than a candidate being seen as part of Team Blue or Team Red. The result is an electorate polarized into two camps with no room for compromise, an intractable electoral split that I myself term Cold Civil War. Now, when it comes to bullets and bayonets, when we get to that point, it's important to remember that city versus countryside is not what it was in mainland China. At a time that everyone understands the archetype, the countryside being the farmer, providing the food, which 99% of Chinese were part of that demographic base. Whereas the 1% lived in the city side and the urban areas on the coast were the functional literati. These were the intellectual powerhouses that made China work as an economy in the world. In America, on the other hand, the city people provide all that and more. They're responsible for the food production because all the agribusiness is headquartered in the cities that brings in the immigrants to pick the fields and make the harvest work and deliver the harvest to everybody, including the country folks. The countryside in America provides two things, Jack and shit. And Jack left town a long time ago. What they used to be were things like coal miners. What they used to be were people who had fled the plantation scene and then became welfare recipients. They produce absolutely nothing. They are parasites. They do not generate any benefit to the American public. They simply excrete shit. Like a parasite that is non-symbiotic, they provide only disease. The disease of hatred and insanity, flat earthism, Holocaust revisionism, the denial that we landed on the moon, a denial of history and reality itself. These are the people who believe the Middle Ages never existed because the Russians tell them so. In other words, every single person of white ethnicity in the countryside could vanish in a rapture. Oh, if only the heavens would open up and take them. And you would see the economy in the United States improve by leaps and bounds because we'd no longer be paying welfare to support these white pigs reveling like a Waller and shit, producing more white trash pieces of shit to suck more of our blood. If every single white person in the countryside died tonight, we would wake up tomorrow without a burden of parasitism that's destroying our ability to live a quality life free from the threat of domestic terrorism by white trash mass shooters. So, that's the difference between the Chinese Civil War and the American Civil War. Whereas the Chinese farmers produced all the food that sustained the people in the cities, the people in the countryside of America do absolutely nothing but suck off the cities with welfare, and their employment levels are 100% unemployment. Statistically and demographically, none of them holds a job. They are human shit. The useless eaters described by the National Socialistisch. They're taking up space and they're wasting valuable oxygen. So these questions are increasingly bound up in other kinds of identities, like religion and city versus countryside, with partisan identity serving as a kind of cultural catch-all. But the end result that it comes down to is what I described as your intractable enemy, that because they offer nothing, because they produce nothing, they have only one thing they can do to make themselves feel better than you: kill you. So far, that civil war is cold, proactive and mobilized, and we haven't yet deployed forces in the field. But when we do, you have to understand what's mobilizing us. The best way to think about this identity divide is a political conflict between two camps with fundamentally different visions of what this nation is, with no room for compromise. This cold civil war, fought not yet with bullets, but instead for now with bitter and zero-sum political contests, in which increasingly Republicans and Democrats see themselves as part of cultural groups fundamentally distinct, consuming different media, attending different churches, living in distinct kinds of places, and never interacting with people who disagree with them, means being a Republican or a Democrat isn't just a political affiliation. It's a catch-all identity standing in for all these distinct identities, a master category defined by views on race and multiculturalism that has come to encompass all manner of other groupings. Political divides like these are powerful. They're self-reinforcing. People don't compromise when their fundamental identity is on the ballot. Hence why it's a civil war, a struggle between two nations within a nation without any room for compromise. There's another book that I have before me titled Uncivil Agreement, written by the University of Maryland's Liliana Mason. I read here from the authoress of Uncivil Agreement, Liliana Mason. I quoted her: "The more sordid we become, the more emotionally we react to normal political events. The angrier the electorate, the less capable we be of finding common ground on policies or even of treating our opponents as human beings." going back to my own narrative from these 3 separate books I've cited so far, each side has some advantages in this war. The Democratic side is more numerous nationally and significantly younger. In theory, we could just wait for Republican voters to die out. But the non-representativeness of American institutions, particularly the Senate and Electoral College, favor naught but Republicans. Blue California's 40 million residents get as many senators as red Wyoming's 500,000 or 580,000, excuse me, 500,000, barely over that. We are, if they're 500,000 and we're 40 million in California and we're the economic engine, we do everything for the United States. The United States is an empire because of California. We have 40 million people here, which are compared to Wyoming's 500,000, means we outnumber them 80-1. And yet they get as many representatives as us because they're white trash pieces of shit who fuck their mothers and their sisters and live in the country. Fucking their dogs, their pigs, and their sheep when they're done with their relatives or when their girls are on a rag. One side will need to beat the other. And while Republicans may have won the first battle by the Russians sponsoring them to hack their election of Trump, Democrats have won the next by taking back the House and gaining the power to strike a serious blow to his illegal, treasonous presidency, his occupation government of Vladimir Putin. What this suggests then is that thinking about Trump-era elections as competitions between competing policy visions is a categorical error. Voters aren't voting on the basis of thought-out views about the role of government. They're voting on the basis of group identity and affiliation. If Democrats want to think about improving on their 2018 victories, they need to spend their time pondering this new reality. And as Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, said himself, to fight a war, you need money, money, and more money. As always in war, mega money talks. Big money, small money, but always more money. Total spending on the elections, these midterms, topped $5.2 billion United States dollars, so estimated by the Center for Responsive Politics. That's the biggest jump in midterm fundraising in the last 20 fucking years. Republican candidates raised record amounts of money, and Democratic candidates raised even more. You might remember what I said about Emperor Hirohito. He fought a private war on his own that he won for his empire on the basis of his empire of the black and invisible sun behind the Koromaku, the black curtain of Imperial Japan. By war's end, after looting all of Asia, by the time there was a cessation in proactive prosecution of hostilities, Emperor Hirohito had $100 billion in today's terms, meaning that in World War II terms, he had hundreds of billions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts, which General MacArthur couldn't touch. That's how he was able to maintain his war on the Chinese mainland, to threaten the United States through the half-decade of talk-down processes that forced the Americans on their knees to open their markets, turn over the majority of their aircraft carriers to the Japanese, to deconstruct and convert into Toyotas to sell back to the Americans. All based on Emperor Hirohito raising enough money the good old-fashioned way. Piracy and plunder. Now, Stuart Rothenberg, a veteran analyst with the nonpartisan Inside Elections, predicts there's no turning back now in the United States politics of war. He observes, I don't think this is going to be a unique circumstance. It's the new reality. There's more money in campaigns than you could ever imagine. Who would think of spending $10 million United States dollars in a House campaign? But this year, over $46 million United States dollars was spent in the most expensive House contest in Georgia's 6th congressional district, and 7 other House races saw a total spend of over 15 million United States dollars. The amount surged both because of a handful of big donors. 13 contributors gave more than 10 million United States dollars each. As I've told you before, when it comes to corporations that you people so vilify in your ignorance because you're programmed to do so by the Russian alternative right, which inherited their anti-corporate stance from the goddamn communists, you're taught to hate corporations. They're not even the ones pumping the money in. It's all individual donors who are multi-billionaires. As I said, 13 of them gave more than 10 million United States dollars each, and millions of small ones. The huge Democratic war chest that this impacted made it possible for that party, my party, the Democratic Party, your party, to finance some longer shot campaigns. And it led to a bigger win for Democrats. On election night, Democrats won control of the House, but feared they had lost 5 Senate elections they had hopes of winning, as well as the Florida and Georgia governor's races. But with Sinema now taking Arizona and Nelson catching up in Florida, we'd have a situation where it's possible that Republicans may have won only 3 of those 5 seats, defeating incumbent Democrats in North Dakota, Missouri, and Indiana alone. Republicans lost the Senate seat held by Senator Dean Heller in Nevada. So far, Republicans have won 51 Senate seats, which is where they stood before the election. They are very likely, due to corruption, win the runoff in Mississippi between Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith and Democratic candidate Mike Espy, the African-American male, giving them 52, but since they lost another, it's back to 51. I mean, they're right back where they start. They haven't even fucking moved. The only thing they got is another female bigot, this cunt who said that the black man ought to be lynched and hanged. And since that's all they get, it totally belies the claim Trump made in his long and grievance-filled news conference on Wednesday that he had led his party to a major victory in the Senate. On the House side, the Democrats on election night seemed to track, they picked up at least 30 seats and then nailed down 31 with a dozen races left uncalled at the time. They have ended up since then, well, I've checked, with about 37, 38 seats, actually closer to 40 based on returns as they kept coming into Democratic advantage. In both chambers, the final numbers have entirely challenged the narrative that emerged on election night of a somewhat disappointing Democratic win. In the full light of day, the party's victory is considerably more impressive. The overall Democratic margin in House votes nationwide came to about 7 percentage points. In 2016, Democrats lost the total House vote by only 1 point. That 8-point swing marks one of the biggest shifts from one party to the other since World War II. All based or resultant Trump's strategy of polarizing the electorate, the highest risk play you can take. Democratic victories were especially concentrated in suburban districts, that battleground, that gray area between the city and the countryside. In the big 3 swing states, that means the counties outside Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Detroit, as well as the heavily Republican suburbs outside Milwaukee, where Republican margins were significantly smaller than usual, sealing the defeat of Governor Scott Walker. The Republicans did well in Ohio, even though the state reelected Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown. Florida is seemingly always a toss-up, and Democrats proved that they swung Arizona. But a Democratic presidential candidate doesn't need to win any of those states to prevail if he or she can win back the 3 big Midwestern and Mid-Atlantic states that Trump stole with the hackings of Vladimir Putin. The question for the next 2 years will be whether Democrats can keep the loyalty of those suburban voters between red and blue, they're called purple zones, that they won this year, and still maintain the enthusiasm for their more liberal voters in the cities. If they can, Trump will be in deep trouble, despite his continued hold on his countryside base of incestuous ignoramuses. Trump secured his 2016 victory with narrow wins in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all through Russian hacking. All 3 of those states swung back heavily to the Democrats this year. And the election will probably be decided once again in the big industrial states of the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic. This is why Trump is seriously considering, or rather, his master, Vladimir Putin, is seriously considering firing Rudolph Giuliani. Now, you can look this up. Vladimir Putin himself almost gave Rudy Giuliani, who was in Russia, the big Trump cliche, you're fired. Because all of Rudy Giuliani's intelligence on America's electoral system didn't help the Russians, help Trump maintain both houses. So, with this 2018 election, you've got a nation divided by education, race, and region. The Democratic gains were powered by women and younger voters. Now, it's always hard to come up with good data the day after an election. But thankfully, I was able to access the CCES, the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, based on my experience as a former Department of Defense research librarian and the contacts I knew to call. That's a sophisticated poll of over 50,000 Americans conducted just before the election takes place. 3 clear patterns emerge from this data, which I'm sourcing before you now. First, Democrats did better with white women than white men. Second, Democrats did significantly better with college-educated whites than non-college educated whites. Third, the South is different. Republicans did far better with whites of all different sorts of backgrounds there than they did anywhere else in the country. When you pile these patterns in the white vote on top of the now familiar racial divides, CNN's exit poll showed Democrats winning 90% of black voters, 69% of Latino voters, and 77% of Asian voters, which surprised even myself. And then you get a clear sense of what led to Tuesday night's results last week. Democrats winning big with minorities and educated whites. But this isn't just an educational divide, it's also a regional one. Another Schaffner chart on the suburbs, the Great Purple Battle Zones, helped clarify how stark these regional differences are. The suburbs are home to many educated whites, but were historically Republican bastions. But in the 2018 midterms last Tuesday, suburban purple voters broke for Democrat blue, with only the South, once again, being the sole exception. Democratic inroads in the suburbs were offset by huge Republican gains in rural areas, the country fucks. In 2012, Missouri Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill won rural Saline County by 22.5 points. In 2018, she lost it by 21.4 points and lost her re-election bid due to similar rural swings around the state. And these results were mirrored around the country. In the Florida statewide races, Democrats overperformed their traditional margins in urban and suburban areas home to many educated whites and Latinos. But Republicans won enormous victories in Florida's less educated, more culturally backwards southern rural areas, the swamp areas where they feed gators their infant babies that they don't want to raise. That resulted in Republican victories in both races that are being recounted now and challenged. So we aren't there yet. In Virginia's 10th congressional district, an increasingly suburban congressional district, Democrats hadn't won since 1981, challenger Jennifer Wesden beat incumbent representative, a Republican, Barbara Comstock, by a hefty 56-44 margin. In Oklahoma 5, where Republican Representative Steve Russell won by more than 20 points in 2016, Democrat Kendra Horn eked out a surprise victory on the strength of her support in Oklahoma City. What this suggests is the old red state, blue state model is completely outdated. America's divides do not fall neatly along state lines, but rather within states and between locales and regions. That's why I always operate in my comprehension of American affairs at the county level. City dwellers, non-Southern educated whites, and minorities vote for Democrats in increasingly large numbers, while rural and less educated whites around the country make up the Republican base. The country dumb fucks. That's the new political divide. A college diploma is the new political divide. The gender gap, the tendency for women to vote more Democrat than men do, is familiar, a regular feature of American elections since 1980. Now a sharp divide over education has added another dimension and opened a new breach between white voters who have a college degree and those too stupid to earn one. African American voters at all education levels typically vote Democratic, as do many Hispanics. But a USA Today analysis of counties across the country who have the largest proportion of residents with college degrees showed significant shift since the last midterm in 2014. Then they voted for the Republican congressional candidate by 15 percentage points. This time, they backed the Democrat by a single point. The education gap is particularly yawning between college-educated white women and non-college educated white men. So the dumbass white boys and the smart-ass white chicks are as far apart as Mars and Venus. They may as well source from those two different planets. So going back into last week's election, college-educated white women preferred Democratic congressional candidates by 18 percentage points. That was confirmed by a Marist NPR National Public Radio poll that found that while white men without a college degree backed Republicans by 33 points, that was concluded by myself in my calculations to be a jaw-dropping 51-point gap over half 100-point gap. That's as wide as you can get. That's across the galaxy. And it helps explain both parties' campaign strategies. Republicans focused on ousting Democratic senators from interior states like Indiana and North Dakota, where the population is whiter, older, and so fucking dumb it's almost impossible for them to have even conceived of a college degree, than states on the coast. Democrats aimed their efforts at defeating House Republicans from suburban districts across the country where more residents have graduated from college and can actually read and write. This signals the start of a realignment between the two major parties, with repercussions for presidential elections all the way down the road for however long this constitutional republic lasts. Consider this. 41% of white men without a college education strongly approve of Trump, one of his best showings. Among college-educated white women, 56% strongly disapprove, one of his worst showings. And that brings us to this being the year of female representation. Even with a few races yet to be concluded, one clear winner emerged from the latest U.S. election: female representation. Nearly 4,000 women ran in federal and state races, an unprecedented number. In the House, 102 women have already been confirmed that I remember consciously, with 7 more still in the running or already confirmed since last time before I started doping and drinking again. In the Senate, 23 women will serve, the same number as now, and one might join them, 24, I believe. That'll set a new record. The potential is now for near 25% female representation in Congress. Not nearly enough, granted, but nevertheless outstanding. Plus, there will be at least 9 female governors, I think 10 now, depending on the result of Georgia's election. Meanwhile, of the 138 elected or appointed men who were accused of sexual harassment in the last election cycle, over 100 of those sons of bitches have left office, overwhelmingly in the wake of #MeToo. Of them, 3 were voted out this past election, 2 losing to women. Justice. Among the women emerging victorious this week that I know of are Sharice Davids and Deborah Haaland, the first 2 Native American women to be elected to Congress. Rashida Tlaib, or Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar, a refugee from Somalia, are the first 2 Muslim women to be elected to the House. With my apologies for butchering their names. Again, I would say Rashida Tlaib, which I believe would be Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar, as in Omar Sharif, O-M-A-R, her surname. And, of course, I'm so happy they've accomplished this in an Islamophobic environment under Russophile Donald Trump. And Angie Craig will be the first openly gay mother to join Congress. The homophobic baker who refused to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex couple now has a gay governor. So woman roar. In the 2018 midterms, Trump defined the emerging Republican Party. Now women, as candidates, contributors, voters, and activists, have defined the emerging Democratic Party. And that began the day after the president was inaugurated with massive women's marches promising resistance. You know, the one which all you motherfuckers who do nothing but look on YouTube and Facebook say we're sponsored by your great booty man, George Soros, passing out pussies for everybody to wear. And what followed was 2 years of unprecedented activism. Take House races tracked by Rutgers Center for American Women in Politics. 476 women filed as candidates. The previous record was 298. On election day, 237 of those ladies were on the ballot. The previous record was 167. Records broken by female contenders for every sort of office, for governorships, Senate seats, and state legislative races. A record donated to campaigns, the Center for Responsive Politics so reported, and off to female candidates. That's who they were donating to. Woman contributed to woman 159 million United States dollars, all to female Democratic candidates, 2.5 times the amount they gave 2 years ago. So Kelly Dittmar, a political scientist at Rutgers and a director of the project called Gender Watch 2018, she says, women voters have outnumbered and outvoted men for nearly 3 decades. So that is not a new trend to this year. But what is notable this year is women's translation of advocacy and activism into both candidacy and political giving. This year, women are claiming their seats at the table. It isn't just America where such progress is being seen. In New Zealand this year, where my primary gang stalker and a keynote cultist who used to be the CEO for Sausage Software was born, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern gave birth while in office. And in London this week, 120 female politicians from around the world gathered in the House of Commons to mark 100 years since women won the right to vote and run for office in the United Kingdom. They came from Gambia, Afghanistan, and over 80 other nations. The accomplishments of such women are more than incremental gains for their respective parties. They're evidence of change. Political progress towards equality is as incremental as it is relentless, one battle at a time. The gender war is being won for female equality with all those idiots who swing a cock between their legs. And you've got a more diverse House in oh so many other ways. The Democratic victories bring with them an increase not only in the number of women in Congress, at least 99 women serving in the new Congress, up from 84, and the number will probably be higher as the final races are called. The new House includes, as I said, the first 2 Muslim and Native American women elected, as well as the first Latina from Texas and the first African American woman from Massachusetts. So women are on track to make up nearly 40% of House Democrats in 2019, but less than 7% of House Republicans. In the Senate, the number of women will tick up to 24 from the current 23 at least 7 Republicans and 16 Democrats, plus whichever candidate won Arizona, which it turned out to be, of course, this Latin American lady. That's changed, of course, with the biggest win in the Trump era, the Democratic swing of what was supposed to be a red state. So what we had, undeniably, incontrovertibly, inarguably, was a big, beautiful blue wave. Forget the Senate. Tuesday's midterm elections last week were a major rebuke of the Trump cult and the Russian-sponsored Republican Occupation Party. Despite Trump's denials, Democrats' elections blue wave is getting bigger and bluer by the goddamn day. There was a sense on election night that Trump and the Republicans had somehow prevented a wave election with a red wall, and that prediction proved entirely premature. Donald Trump wants you to desperately believe that last Tuesday's midterms elections were a big victory for him, himself, and his Republican call. But like so much of what Trump says, it's simply not true. The reality was that Tuesday's election was truly a blue wave. In fact, it's getting bigger and bluer every day with the recounts. Since election night, Democrats picked up even more seats as close races became finalized in their favor. As of now, Democrats have officially picked up, I'm just looking it up now on the internet, 33 seats in the House, and with nearly a dozen House races still too close to call, Democrats are actually going to get 40 when all is said and done. Largest Democratic gain since Watergate. The last time Democrats won more House seats in a midterm election would be over 40 years ago, back in 1974, in large part a response to Watergate, the biggest political scandal of the modern era, and President Richard Nixon had just resigned in August of that year. And it gets better for the Democrats. They flipped 7 governorships, including in the very red state of Kansas, knocked off former Republican presidential candidate and current Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. Sure, the Republicans picked up a few Senate seats, but overall in this election, approximately 15% more Americans voted for the Democratic candidates for the Senate than for the Republicans. And Democrats flipped that red Senate seat to blue in Arizona when Democrat Kyrsten Sinema officially defeated Republican opponent Martha McSally on November 12th, the day before yesterday. And we're even seeing a likely recount in the Florida Senate contest between Republican Rick Scott and the incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson. In total, Democrats did better this year than the last Democratic wave in 2006, when the President George W. Bush deemed it a thumping. That year, Democrats picked up 31 House seats, 6 governorships, and 6 Senate seats. This time, Democrats outperformed in terms of House and governor's wins. But yet, there was a sense on election night, as the results came in, that Trump and the Republicans had somehow prevented this wave election. I even heard firsthand from some fellow progressives who were practically despondent since we didn't see wins in the very visible races that myself and many others were emotionally invested in, such as Andrew Gillum in Florida, Stacey Abrams in the Georgia gubernatorial race, and Beto O'Rourke's improbable run for Senate in Texas. As of now, there's still some limited hope for Gillum and Abrams, who are locked in races deemed too close to call. And there was also the dream, against all rational odds, that Democrats would wrest control of the U.S. Senate, despite the cold, hard math that made this scenario highly unlikely. So we didn't get the Senate. The United States Senate no longer has any reason to exist, and only serves to help entrenched interests escape accountability while maximizing partisan rancor and getting in the way of productive solutions to this nation's problems. It was originally designed to placate slave-holding states that were less populous, in part because they didn't count the enslaved workers who actually produced their wealth as people, by giving them equal representative power with less morally wretched non-slave states. The Senate has since then turned into a distorted mockery of democracy. Wyoming and North Dakota, as I said, with less than 700,000 people each, for some reason get the same amount of power in the Senate as California and New York's combined over 60 million people, while whining every day about people from Los Angeles or Brooklyn telling them how to live. The injustice be the other way around, I assure you. Countryside monochrome states with less population than a mid-sized American city shouldn't have any business enforcing their peculiar, bubble-driven paranoias on the dynamic and diverse population of America's cultural, technological, and agricultural giants, who feed them and give them the technology by which to maintain their electronic echo bubbles. And yet, because of this injustice, a deeply unpopular president who was just resoundingly rejected at the ballot box will be able to rubber stamp his judicial and other appointments without pushback from a corrupted anti-majoritarian institution. But Democrats need to savor this astounding victory nonetheless. It will truly have an impact in big and small ways, and not just because we saved America from becoming more Trumpistan. Democrats now control the House for the first time since 2010. That means Democrats will set the agenda in that chamber, will have vast investigatory powers, and every single committee will be chaired by a Democrat. No more Trump ally Representative Devin Nunes, representative of California, Republican, heading the House Intelligence Committee and protecting Trump. In fact, Nunes told voters in a secretly recorded tape released in August that the Republican House majority was desperately needed to protect Trump. That red wall's not there anymore. Come January 3rd, when the new Congress is sworn in, it's goodbye to the Republican House control and hello to committee chairs who may finally be able to hold Trump accountable. For example, the House Intelligence Committee will be chaired by vocal Trump critic Adam Schiff, Democrat of California, a former federal prosecutor who can be counted on to use his committee as a real check on executive power. Meanwhile, Representative Maxine Waters, California Democrat, a person Trump has publicly demeaned as having a low IQ because she's a black woman, will likely head the House Financial Services Committee, where she will be able to subpoena officials at financial regulatory agencies for both information and testimony. And we can't forget the 7 governors' races Democrats won. This means positive changes can be expected quickly for citizens of Maine, Kansas, and Wisconsin, where the candidates ran in large part on promise to expand Medicaid in order to provide residents with health insurance. And importantly, after the census in 2020, a Democratic governor should be able to ensure that the Republicans can't grotesquely gerrymander the congressional and state legislative districts in these states as well. In other words, Trump can claim the results were a big victory all he wants. The reality is that the midterms wave election, Democrats are now in a great position for the next big goal, winning back the White House. But as the midterms have shown, eradicating the disease of Trumpism will take more than just an energized Democratic base. Trump's cult of blasphemous, pseudo-religious, ethno-nationalist regressionism has taken the Republican Party. Over the last 6 months in particular, Republican gubernatorial candidates in Florida and Georgia ran 2 of the most explicitly racist campaigns in recent memory and won, likely validating the strategy in their own febrile minds. Expect future Republican candidates to lean even further into voter suppression and white grievance. But even if Democrats didn't win some of the biggest and unlikeliest races, they ended up where many predicted, a little worse off in the Senate and much better off in the House and the states, where they have been eviscerated in recent years. The party made important inroads in the Midwest and South. Chris Kobach lost his gubernatorial campaign in Kansas, while Texas and Georgia are seemingly in play for 2020. And although Gillum and O'Rourke lost, their competitive races likely boosted statewide turnout and contributed to the unseating of key House Republicans like Carlos Cabello in Florida and Pete Sessions in Texas. The media might focus on the Democrats' high-profile losses, even though most were either underdogs, like O'Rourke, or incumbents in states that Trump won 2 years ago. But the real indicator is the Democrats' popular vote total, which is projected to significantly outpace the Republicans. Given that this was a midterm election, and that the Senate map was extremely unfavorable to Democrats, who had to defend 26 of the 35 seats up for election, those numbers will likely increase in 2020. With more of the country up for grabs, Republicans may be forced to expend resources in unexpected places. Abrams and O'Rourke in particular showed Democrats how to run in those places. The midterms were a reminder that the fight against Trump will not be easy, especially given Republicans' many structural advantages for the incipient Republican one-party state, including the Electoral College, voter suppression, and gerrymandering. But Tuesday's results were also a reminder that the fundamentals are on Democrats' side. A majority of American voters still favor the Democrats over Trump and his cult, and have now granted them the power to lead investigations into the administration and block Republican legislation. As the African-American male, the news pundit, Van Jones, born Anthony Capel Jones, an American news commentator, author, and non-practicing attorney, the co-founder of several nonprofit organizations, including the Dream Corps, a social justice accelerator that operates 3 advocacy initiatives, hashtag Cut50, hashtag Yes We Code, and Green for All. As he said later in the evening of Tuesday night, after CNN called the House for Democrats, he said, "My heart has been restored. It is the end of one-party rule in the United States, thank God Almighty, and the beginning of a new Democratic Party." And yet, despite all that, it was in its own way a hopeless election, because the outcome on Tuesday also proved American politics will only get worse. When stumping for Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams last week, Former President Barack Obama made the case that Tuesday's midterms were an existential test for the nation. The midterms were the most important election of our lifetime. The character of our country is on the ballot. He sent a series of tweets that were absolutely right. Vote, you have the power to make it easier for a student to afford college and harder for a disturbed person to shoot up a classroom. When you vote, you have the power to make sure a family keeps its health insurance. When you vote, you have the power to protect voting rights, to make sure our criminal justice system treats everyone equally under law, to strengthen laws that protect women in the workplace from harassment, to make certain they're paid equally. He's right on all counts to an extent. Tuesday's election was the nation's first real opportunity to rebuke a president who has repeatedly abused his office, and a party that's deliberately sabotaged the health care of millions, damaged the rule of law, redistributed wealth to the richest Americans, caused significant damage to long-standing diplomatic relations. It was our chance to reject Trump and Trump cultism, especially given the racist tenor of the Republicans' midterms push. It was all important, especially at the state level, where Republican governors and legislatures have been trampling on voting rights, and so we did. If Republicans had preserved their control of Congress, it would have been devastating, leading to the end of the Mueller investigation, the repeal of Obamacare. Now I'm going to take a short break, drink some tea. I'm not going anywhere. Stay right there. I'm going to take a breath. We're entering our last hour. Now, I'm going to do my best to wind this up, but we may go a half an hour after that. So, diving right in. We were talking about this being essentially a repudiation of Donald Trump in the midterm elections. We were talking about everything that was going on with the dynamics of the new society, the new electoral divide, the new dynamics of this cold civil war in which we are not yet at the point of bullets and bayonets and forces deployed in the field, but we are very definitely at a point where we want people to understand the imperative of this, the dire nature of this. They are on the new link now, and it's perfect. Okay, everyone is on the new link. People are getting it. They're moving to the new link. And with the new link, after people have refreshed their page and reset their pages, they're going to hear the actual conclusion of everything that we have gone through tonight to bring us to this point. And God bless our Grand Madam Ramona Halitha Henry, the closest thing we have to a chat room monitor. God bless everybody who's in the closest thing we have to a chat room. And everybody's excited that they can hear me. This is like, you know, it's like a seance. You actually contacted the other side. You've got, you know, dead Uncle Ben talking to you. And it's one of those things where Uncle Ben is giving you the numbers to bet on in the next lottery. That's, you know, that's exciting. So people are enthusiastic about this. And with all that going down, definitely appreciate the fact that so many of our dear friends, brothers and sisters have stuck with us throughout Team Dietrich's struggles on this cold winter's night. And now that we're here, I can get back down to business. Now, while the character of the nation state of the constitutional republic, while the character of America might have been on the midterm electoral ballot, the character of its politics aren't changing anytime soon. No matter what happened on Tuesday, the state of American politics can only get worse. The slow but inexorable blue wave from Tuesday undoubtedly struck a blow. We'll call it a poll blow to the president and his party. The Democrats has taken the House, and therefrom shall still do an enormous amount of damage, ensnaring Trump in investigations into his finances, behaviors, deviancies, and governance for years to come. Had they taken the Senate as well, the Democrats could have constrained his power by refusing to confirm judges, as Jeff Flake threatened to do over tariffs, and executive branch appointees. But such was always the unlikeliest outcome. What will come be reasonable and overdue actions.
But they will be met with a furious response. Since the Democrats took the House but not the Senate, would-be Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Trump will spend the next 2 years locking horns over subpoena after subpoena. That's if Nancy Pelosi is elected, not someone in her place. The Senate will respond by acting as a shield, locking horns with the Democrats and with the same Republican lawmakers holding that shield up as a barrier who stepped in to protect Brett Kavanaugh. Chuck Grassley, John Cornyn, Lindsey Graham, all doing their best to distract from or downplay the Trump mega scandals. This particular dynamic likely wouldn't change even if the Democrats had prevailed to take the Senate. So I'm getting a question from our lady about whether this be the right link. And we're going to hear echo now. That confirms it. So you've heard an echo. That is the link. And we've got 4 likes on it already. Bless everybody's hearts. And with that, of course, I will return to the important points and conclusions of tonight's adventure, which is pretty much what this was. And oh my God, what an adventure it was. Hopefully we can stabilize with Rose Dio's case and get this on up and running as audio file to everyone as soon as possible. Now, theoretically, divided government could lead to compromise, since Trump would need Democrats to pass legislation. With 2020 approaching, the thinking would go, he would be incentivized to make deals that show that he can get things done, on infrastructure, for instance. But Trump has displayed or manifested absolutely no interest whatsoever in this kind of politics. Yes, he's flirted with bipartisanship in the past, but has always ultimately demurred, either due to pressure from aides and donors or from a preternatural devotion to his base. When pressed, Trump has eschewed deal-making and calls for unity and doubled down on attacks on both the media and his Democratic opposition. Over the last 2 years, past being prelude, despite controlling Washington, Republicans have done little with their power, certainly nothing constructive. Their only major legislative achievement was the $1.5 trillion United States dollar tax cut, largely benefiting corporations and the wealthy, which appears to represent the entirety of the party's ideology. The Republicans' political or policy apathy has become apparent over the last 2 months as candidates across the country have embraced the president's ethno-nationalism and racist immigrant policy. With defeat looming, the Republicans saw fear-mongering as the only way to get their aging white base to the polls, a strategy that worked 2 years before. Expect Republicans to employ these tactics, even in defeat, and from this point forward, forevermore. In fact, they will employ them especially as they continue to lose ground demographically to the real world. The most Republicans to lose in Tuesday's midterms were the most moderate members of Congress, those in suburban districts won by Hillary Clinton in 2016. That meant the ordinary Freedom Caucus member got reelected even in a blue wave, while the vulnerable members were the more moderate ones who represented swing districts. This produced the somewhat ironic and yet entirely all too predictable result in our next Congress. The bigger the blue wave, the more regressive the Republican caucus ends up being when it's over, what's left of it, and the less equipped the Republicans will be to run a different kind of campaign, any different kind of campaign in 2020. This is it. They found themselves. They're there. They're stuck there forever. They put their hands around the tar baby of race hatred, and this is their future. They are cemented. The Republicans' embrace of a migrant caravan that's hundreds of miles away is instructive. The caravan poses no national security risk whatsoever, but Republicans and their allies have made all kinds of wild insinuations, suggesting it be full of gang members, terrorists, and lepers. all three put together, mind you. Though some Republicans worry that the caravan will cost the party voters, thus far it appears to be a successful get-out-the-vote strategy, as well as a distraction from more pressing issues that don't reflect well on President Trump, from Saudi Arabia's carnage to yet more administration scandals. As the walls close in on Trump, the racist appeals will only increase by orders of magnitude, to the point where they're calling for genocide in the streets and mass murder as the national polity. Mark my words, it can only go there. That's the only place left to go. Race war. Not race baiting. Race war. Republicans opened the Pandora's box that led to Trump's presidency 2 years ago in their treasonous collaboration with the Russian insurgency, which they now represent as the Russian administrative government, the RAG. They have become, as the midterm campaign has made clear, a party whose core identity is based around xenophobia and white grievance. Democratic victories on Tuesday set in motion the end of Trump's presidency. They will certainly provide a level of oversight that has been sorely lacking for the past 2 years, and the Republicans will respond by heeding their worst instincts, because the base instincts are all that's left. What happens in 2020 may be anybody's guess, but the final scene of the cinematic masterpiece Reservoir Dogs comes to mind. That brings us to, again, what the African-American male pundit Van Jones said. This be no blue wave, it's a blue war. The infestation of hate remains. As Van Jones observed, as far as we can ascertain with the count still ongoing, there may as well still be people standing in line in Georgia and Florida. This is not over. People need to stay out there and continue the fight. It is heartbreaking. The hope has been that the antibodies would kick in, that this infestation of Russian-injected hate and division would draw a response from the American people in both political parties to say, no, no more. That doesn't seem to have happened on Tuesday night. It was a blue wave, but it's still a blue war. We've got to continue to move the fight forward. And I myself think that sense of helplessness that has really fueled a lot of this outrage and outpouring from Democrats is still there now, even though we hold the House. On the bright side, as we'll address in this last hour, I'm not even going to take a break. We're going to have Rose Dio edit out those elements that were kind of introductory, so to speak, as everyone readjusted. On the side of immediate attainment or manifestation of gratification, instant gratification, if you will, immediate results, Tuesday night was the end of the Obamacare war. Obamacare is recovering. In the past 2 midterms, no issue hurt Democratic congressional candidates more than the Affordable Care Act. Backlash to the law contributed to the historic loss of 63 House seats in 2010, and with that, Democratic control, and an additional 13 in 2014. Since Obamacare was enacted in 2009, Republicans campaigned on a promise to repeal it in 4 successive elections. Despite holding dozens of votes, they failed to do that even after winning the White House and total control of both houses of Congress. This time, in a turnaround, most of the ads that mentioned the Affordable Care Act this time were being aired by Democrats who accused Republicans of undermining its protection for patients with pre-existing health conditions. The Wesleyan Media Project calculated that close to 60% of the TV ads supporting Democratic congressional candidates last month mentioned health care. Fewer than 10% of Democratic ads did so in 2010 and 2014. Republicans, on the other hand, were on the defensive about their vote last year to weaken Obamacare's protections by allowing states to waive some of the law's requirements. What's more, Republican attorneys general in 20 states have joined in a lawsuit that challenges the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act and would overturn the framework that protects coverage for those with chronic illnesses. One result of this election will probably be to end the long Republican effort to repeal Obamacare. With Democrats in control of the House, no repeal measure will come to the floor, and in the Senate, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky has shown no interest in jumping back into the fight. Republicans repeatedly promised on the campaign trail to keep the law's protections for people with pre-existing health problems, locking in one major provision of the law that they had tried to repeal. And voters approved referendums to expand Medicaid under the law in Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah, all reactionary states. By the end of this campaign, Trump and other Republicans were promising not to repeal Obamacare, but to preserve those protections, although they offer few specifics about how they would do that. In exit polls by a media consortium, including ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC, 4 in 10 called health care the most important issue, far more than the number who cited immigration or the economy or even firearms policy. What this electoral midterms also provided, obviously, was the end for Jeff Sessions. But the crazy times are just beginning. Post-midterms, Trump has gone on the attack. Trump wasted no time in firing his attorney general, forcing him to turn in a resignation, who was one of his earliest and strongest supporters, but who angered the president by not blocking the investigation into Russian efforts to sway the 2016 election. By firing Jeff Sessions the day after the Republicans lost the House, the president made clear he won't be constrained. Democrats hope to use their new power in the House to try to protect the Russia investigation, led by Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III. Republican Adam Schiff of Burbank, who is in line to regain the chairmanship of the House Intelligence Committee, says he wants to determine if Russians have financial leverage over the president by laundering money through the Trump Organization. Schiff has been quoted as saying there's nothing the president cares more about than his wealth. But a young fangirl of ours, Lena Shea, has observed, it's not his wealth Trump's worried about, it's his fucking life. Vladimir Putin's just told him outright he's going to kill him if he doesn't toe the line. So Trump will only get more and more dangerous. The dismissal of Jeff Sessions makes this much clearer. The Republicans' midterm defeat has made Trump more desperate to undermine the rule of law. Jeff Sessions was, as I went into great detail back when I was on Revolution Radio, back in the Pleistocene, the Stone Age, before men evolved to walk upright and got off their knuckles, I back then articulated in great detail that Jeff Sessions was unfit to serve as Attorney General of the United States. He had lied about his civil rights record, claiming that he desegregated schools in Alabama when he had done no such thing, as he later admitted under oath. He and his surrogates misled the public by insisting that he had begun his political life campaigning against the segregationist Lurleen Wallace without mentioning that her Republican opponent was also a segregationist. He exaggerated his role in the prosecution of the Ku Klux Klansmen who lynched Michael Donald. He praised the racist 1924 immigration law that targeted non-whites the year after mine own late St. Cyrus, my mother, was born into this world. And, of course, that immigration law that was put into effect the year after she was born, she was still in the Empire of Japan, of course, that goes without saying, but that immigration law that came into effect after she was delivered targeted non-whites of all the chromatic spectrum, Eastern and Southern Europeans, and Jews. And, of course, Jeff Sessions was rejected for a federal judgeship for allegedly calling a black attorney a boy and a civil rights attorney a race traitor. On every crucial question of civil rights in the past 40 years, Jeff Sessions has been on the wrong side. He also misled the Senate under oath about his contacts with Russian officials during the 2016 campaign, then lied about having lied. All this alone disqualifying him from being the top cop in the United States. If his record opposing basic constitutional rights for marginalized groups was not disqualifying, his rank honesty should have been. As Attorney General, Sessions rolled back civil rights enforcement, failing to file even a single voting rights case in a country where the Republican Party has settled on disenfranchisement of rival constituencies as a tactic for winning elections. Jeff Sessions failed in his duty to prevent the president from attempting to influence the FBI investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, and then aided the president in presenting a patently false justification for firing former FBI Director James Comey over that investigation. Even though I've deconstructed James Comey as being part of the conspiracy originally, all these traitors and criminals turn on each other. There be no honor among thieves. In virtually every consequential way, Jeff Sessions should have gone down in history as one of the worst attorney generals ever to hold office years ago. Yeah, I mean, like right after he was sworn in, like, you know, years ago. Yet in one important sense, Sessions' forced departure is alarming. Sessions, for all his flaws, envisioned the position of Attorney General as an office that should resist political pressure from the White House and one whose ultimate loyalty be to the Constitution. It was that view that caused Sessions under pressure to agree to recuse himself from the Russia investigation. This runs contrary to the central tenet of the Trump cult, which holds that the highest loyalty be not to the public, service to either them, the taxpayers, the nation, or the Constitution, but to Donald Trump as an individual, in the person thereof. The president was enraged that Sessions' recusal meant that he could not control the investigation himself. He will not make that mistake with his next choice of Attorney General, which of course has been entirely unconstitutional. Trump's losses in the midterms will not make him more cautious. They'll only make him more dangerous. Trump's only true ideological commitment is to his racially exclusive vision of American citizenship. His authoritarianism is more instinctive than ideological, closely tied to his desire to enrich himself and his allies without facing legal consequences. Sheer plunder in the last great American bank heist since the days of the Bush Jr. administration. If the only way the president can save his own skin, or that of others implicated in his corruption, be to violate the rule of law, he most certainly has no compunctions about doing so. With Democrats in charge of the House, the president is no doubt confident that he can blatantly break the law and still convince his supporters, sealed in an impenetrable bubble of pro-Trump propaganda, that he did no such thing. Protecting the rule of law will fall to a Republican majority in the Senate, whose willingness to do so is deeply in question. Indeed, the president said as much during his press conference Wednesday morning of last week, warning that if House Democrats looked into this campaign or his finances, he would retaliate. Trump said, and I quote his "He, they can look at us, we can look at them, and it'll go back and forth, and it'll probably be very good for me politically. I can see it being extremely good politically because I think I am better at that game than they are, actually." The racial element of Trump cultism is an essential one, but so is this. Trump believes that he and his friends and allies be above the law. There be no act they could commit that would warrant prosecution or sanction. Simultaneously, there be no act committed by his critics or rivals that cannot be subject to prosecution, should he so choose. It be not simply that the president does not believe in the rule of law. It be that he believeth the rule of law is a shield that protecteth him, and a sword that can be used to impale his enemies. Nothing has made this issue clearer than his constant demands for prosecution of his critics, and his decision to issue federal pardons to men like Dinesh D'Souza, the Yellow House nigger, who was prosecuted for felony-level campaign finance crimes, and then became a propagandist on behalf of Donald Trump, who released him into the wilder politics yet again, and Joe Arpaio, the white trash piece of shit sheriff whose violations of the law Trump regarded as trivial because they are all, both the Yellow House nigger Dinesh D'Souza and the white trash piece of shit Joe Arpaio, pro-Trump sycophants. This be not how things are supposed to work in a democracy, and certainly not in the United States, but with Sessions gone, Trump will be looking for a replacement, and has found one, again, that he's appointed unconstitutionally, who sees the law the way he does, as a set of rules that applies to his enemies, but no to himself or the charmed circle that surrounds him. The danger to American democracy did not subside with White House Republicans or the House Republicans' defeat in the midterms. It's only grown. But Special Counsel Robert Mueller is spoken of oft, but never speaks himself. Zero public words since his appointment 18 months ago, as Washington awaits his final report. With an acting attorney general that is decidedly skeptical of the Russia investigation scope, Mueller and his team may still have recourse should the new attorney general, take steps to gut their work. In any case, there be multiple reasons why the window of opportunity to fire Mueller has passed. It's too late to stop Mueller. The prospects for interference are dimmer than many imagine. At the end of last month, with the midterms looming, I argued for optimism because, among other things, Mueller's time has yet to be. 18 months ago, President Donald Trump had an opportunity to disrupt the Russia investigation. He had fired the FBI director, had rocked the Justice Department back on its heels, but Trump dithered. He broadcast his intentions too many times. And in the meantime, Mueller moved decisively, securing important indictments and convictions, making whatever preparations were necessary for hostile fire. And now Democrats are poised and have since taken the House of Representatives. The window of opportunity be gone. In the 48 hours since Trump fired Jeff Sessions, the time that I was analyzing this, and installed Matthew Whitaker as acting attorney general, I had occasion during that 2-day period to wonder whether I was being overly optimistic, but a week before. Whitaker be the kind of bad dream from which career Justice Department officials wake up at night in a cold sweat over. He's openly political. The president is confident in his loyalty and that he won't recuse himself from the investigation, notwithstanding his public statements about it and his having chaired the campaign of one of the grand jury witnesses. There be legal questions, of course, constitutionally so, about his installation at the department's helm. So he's an illegal, unconstitutional agent in direct deploy of the executive. And he's known as the White House's eyes and ears of justice. It's bad. Very bad. All of which leads Philip Lacavara, who served in the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office, to conclude that it was Mueller, not Trump, who missed his moment. Writing in the Washington Post, Lacavara worried that by waiting until after the midterms to issue his final report about President Trump's plausible culpability, Mueller has effectively missed his market and may have doomed the investigation. With Sessions gone and the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein no longer in charge of the investigation, Lacavara wrote, the new Attorney General, whether it be Whitaker or someone else, will be free to constrain Mueller's investigation and suppress the special counsel's findings. Any report by Mueller must go to the Attorney General, who decides what, if anything, to do with it. Sessions' replacement will be far more comfortable suppressing the report now that firmer Republican control of the Senate protects not only Trump but also the new Attorney General from any risk of being ousted in a post-impeachment trial. Democrats have much to celebrate about the midterms, but their elation should be tempered by the realization that the election also may have spelled the end for Mueller's Russia investigation, which was too long in getting to the punchline. Now, leave aside for now the question of whether Lacavara's critique is fair to Mueller. To assess, after all, whether Mueller should have moved faster, one would have to know more about the state of his investigation than I myself at least know. Lacavara is certainly correct about one big thing. The prospects for interference with the Mueller investigation went up dramatically with Whitaker's appointment. Yet that said, I stand by my conclusion. I am still, if only tentatively, of the belief that prospects for interference are dimmer than fear and panic and another Trump-busted norm have us imagining. There's at least a dozen reasons to think that Whitaker may have less capacity to foil Mueller than the current moment and his formal powers may suggest. First, Mueller spread the wealth around. The normal critique of special counsel investigations is that they hoard jurisdiction, endlessly expand, become personal roving inquests into their political subjects' lives. The opposite is the case with Mueller. He's not merely referred to other Justice Department components, matters at the margins of his investigation, such as the Michael Cohen situation in New York. He's also let other components handle matters involving core questions of Russian interference in the U.S. elections, such as the Maria Butina and Alina Kushyaevnova prosecutions. The result of this strategic step is not just that Mueller is relatively invulnerable to the change of any kind of power grab or mission creep, it's also that firing him or reining him in only does so much. If Trump imagines these investigations as a cancer on his presidency, they are a cancer that's already metastasized. Second, the investigation's already progressed very far. It's one thing to squelch an investigation in its crib. It's another thing to squelch an investigation that's already collected important evidence and brought key cases. The effort to do so cannot take place invisibly, as a great many prosecutors and FBI agents will be aware of what's happening. None of them has to leak anything for that awareness to find its way to Capitol Hill, because the Hill is already aware of the problem and looking for signs. Mueller is, by many accounts, writing a report, a step that signals a completed investigation or a completed portion of an investigation. The effort to suppress that report could be politically galvanizing and, in its own way, as damaging for the administration as the contents of that report when they eventually become public. Third, Mueller does not have to remain silent. Mueller has used silence as a powerful strategic instrument throughout his investigation. He's done this for a variety of reasons, and the silence has served him well. Among other things, it has given his voice, if and when he ever chooses to use it, enormous moral and political power. The day that Mueller holds a press conference or stands before cameras and declares his investigation is facing interference from the Justice Department will be a very big day, perhaps a game-changing day. If the department suppresses his report, he has the capacity to, as James Comey did after his firing, testify before Congress about what happened. Mueller has not hoarded power or jurisdiction, but he has hoarded moral authority. If Whitaker or his successor seeks to frustrate the probe, Mueller can spend down those huge reserves of credibility. Fourth, the midterms matter, and they mean investigations. Squelching a high-profile, politically explosive investigation of the president is hard enough in this country under any circumstances. When the opposition party controls powerful congressional committees and is committed to oversight, it's that much harder. The Democratic takeover of Congress means that key committees will be watching every move Whitaker and his successor make with respect to the investigation. It means subpoenas for any report they may try to suppress. It means an open and receptive forum for Mueller to testify should he have something to say. It means constant investigation, and it means that the threat of impeachment hangs over everything. This is a very big change, and Mueller is as aware of it as anyone. As a result of Democratic control of the House, he could, for example, write an unclassified summary of his report and conclusions with every expectation that major congressional committees would demand it and release it publicly. He could also write an impeachment referral if he thought he had evidence Congress needs to see, and dare Whitaker to prevent its transmission to Congress. If Whitaker were to do so, Mueller could resign and announce what happened and let Congress do the rest. Having Democrats in control of the House matters enormously. Fifth, the confirmation process for the Attorney General still matters. Whitaker is ultimately a placeholder. He can do damage while in office, but ultimately the president is going to have to name an Attorney General, and the Senate's going to have to confirm that person. That means two big things. Trump has to name someone who can win confirmation, and the nominee has to personally face the Senate Judiciary Committee. The midterms strengthen the president's hand in the Senate, both by increasing the Republican caucus and as a consequence of the departure of Republicans such as Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, the moderates who might have been expected to take a stand against an unacceptable nominee, but there be still senators who might well draw some lines. And that's mattered in the past. The reason Chris Wray, and not someone wholly unacceptable for the role, is FBI director today be that confirmability required it. Moreover, the confirmation process offers a genuine and meaningful opportunity for senators to force a nominee publicly and under oath to commit himself or herself to supervising the investigation in a non-political manner. These things matter. During Watergate, Elliot Richardson resigned as Attorney General rather than firing Archibald Cox, precisely because he had given the Senate his word that he would protect the special prosecutor. 6. Corrupting the Justice Department is harder than you might think. Trump has tried very hard. He openly declares his ambition that the department's function should be to protect him and he alone, as well as prosecute his enemies. and they alone. And yet the norms and traditions of the department have proved uncommonly robust and sticky, and have frustrated him at every turn. Yes, cultures can be corrupted, and we should certainly worry that Whitaker comes into the department's leadership in service of Trump's declared goal of specifically corrupting its culture with intent. But don't underestimate the difficulty of the project, particularly with Congress watching and journalists making the rounds every day. The culture has defended itself remarkably, ably so far, and will continue to do so. Seventh, senior Justice Department officials, both career and political, can draw lines. This point be closely related to the previous one I've just articulated, but also distinct. One indication that the system has held so far be that we have not seen mass resignations or resignations in protest over matters of principle. That will change if Whitaker or his successor moves against the investigation in a fashion that officials regard as unacceptable. Rosenstein, for example, has assiduously defended and protected the Mueller investigation, staking his personal credibility on the endeavor. Will he and Wray, who has to think about how the FBI rank and file will react to his sitting on his heels while a major FBI investigation is buried, really do nothing if Whitaker impedes Mueller? Even if they be inclined to passivity, the norms and expectations of the department will demand more of them, particularly if underlings threaten to resign if they do not act. Eighth, Whitaker will get briefed and assume responsibility for the department. It may sound naive to say that this will matter, but let's at least consider the possibility it will. It'd be one thing to spout off #MAGA nonsense about Mueller on CNN while you're a private citizen. But Whitaker, assuming he does not recuse himself, will now get briefed on the actual Mueller investigation, having taken an oath of office to preserve and protect the Constitution. Let's assume for a moment that Mueller will have compelling facts and his briefing will be impressive, as I know it will be. It would be hard to look Bob Mueller in the face, discussing his actual investigation with the facts and legal theories squarely on the table, and then carry water for the subject of that investigation. If Whitaker does this, the nakedness of it will be transparent to all involved and trigger some of the cultural and normative reactions described in my previous points. It's also possible, if unlikely, given Whitaker's background, that Whitaker will actually be moved by reality when confronted with it. Moreover, the norms and history of the Justice Department are extremely powerful and act upon those who show up. Think of Sessions, a political animal who got confirmed and then immediately recused himself on the advice of career officials. Perhaps Whitaker will defy all of this, but it's not an easy thing to do. And if Whitaker does it, he will do it knowing that he will go down in history as a John Mitchell figure. That should at least be food for thought on his part. Ninth, the public actually does care. Thursday evening last week, tens of thousands of people around the country protested Trump's move against Sessions. That's before Whitaker actually does anything. People around the country care a great deal about protecting Mueller, about learning the truth about Russian intervention in our elections, and about Trump's abuses of power. Expect political pressures to grow proportionately to the increased threat to accountability. This public vigilance and anger is not just #resistance noise, it's actively useful. And finally, 10th, these points all work in tandem with one another. They be not discrete. They operate in an ineffable combination of bureaucratic maneuvering, congressional action, journalism, personality, and public pressure. And in this dangerous moment, and Whitaker's installation does create a profoundly dangerous moment, a constitutional crisis, as a matter of fact, the combined effects here will be a powerful defense against misdeeds. So now, at the bottom of the hour, we turn back to our brother in battle, J.Mo Reese, who I do ask to return to Facebook once he's had his time away. And he did thank Mystic Warrior. She, Rose Dio, relayed unto myself a new message from him. I thank you. He's referring to my latest transmission, where I was tripping balls and sleep talking. He says, I thank you for this transmission, and I thank Douglas for the shout-out. My Facebook was attracting the wrong attention and was also quite a time-consuming and depressing medium for me that brought out the worst of me and ate too much time. It is for this reason, seeing the self-control I was losing on the medium, with the capacity for conflict, I had decided it best to shut it down. there be an eerie transmogrification individuals experience on the medium, not to mention the irritant of the same regurgitated memes from so-called individuals who requested me as a friend in the past. With anyone being a cultist of a very undesirable individual, he referring to either Trump or Michael Aquino or both, they are on the same moral level, I myself assure you, as Douglas Dietrich. We return now to JMO's message. It's be safest to just utilize YouTube as a medium since my occult practice and interests are already exposed on it. The absurdity of the white American gun fetish be this. Now he references Lao Tzu and quotes the founding father of Taoism. Now arms, weapons, however beautiful, be instruments of evil omen. Hateful, it may be said, to all creatures. Therefore he who has Tao will have nothing to do with them. And, again, referencing Lao Tzu, the good man wins a victory and then stops. He will not go on to acts of violence. Winning, he boasteth not. He will not triumph. He shows no arrogance. He wins because he cannot choose. After his victory, he will not be overbearing. Obviously, this is all the opposite of Donald Trump. Again, returning to our message from JMO Reese, this nation never had the maturity of China or Japan, having been founded or never having embraced any philosophy of greater advanced thought outside of certain movements such as civil rights movements, it itself being founded on genocide, bigotry, and an utter lack of self-control is still pervasive within this society, with the opposite of what Lao Tzu says bringest virtue. Overwhelming force, violence, and meaningless war devoid of any training of virtue gives us a violent monstrosity. I sadly don't see this as changing, but becoming worse. Facebook's values under Zuckerberg are no doubt a symbol of the great American ignorance and anti-morality. This be more reason to kick the medium to the curb personally, which I can respect as Douglas Dietrich. JMO himself says, this is the land of the anti-Tao, or a complete perversion of the virtues. I also, continuing quoting JMO Reese here, I also can't help but see the fires in California as a massive sacrifice, but also a symbolic prelude of a nation that will burn itself out, as this is all that is inevitable in an unbalanced and corrupted state. It turning in on itself, especially due to the super imbalance between Democratic and Republican, white and every other ethnicity, men, woman, and which is still extremely unbalanced and devolving into sheer oppression, and its own lack of embracing balance will no doubt inevitably be a prelude to an internal civil war. When he says what he says, we can interpret G-I-E, as either children or God, as the spirit of God is within all children, and also Jah, Yah, the original Hebrew for the God. And of course, what he's describing in physics is described as implosion. Now, returning back to his actual quote, the last line thereof, JMO Reese says, the philosophies of the East, what makes a warrior, and what war really is, can serve America were this country not a culture where ignorance is worshipped. And then Paul Edward answered, JMO, brother in battle, thanks to your distancing of Facebook. It got me to take myself out of every Facebook group, about half 100 of them, and trim the friends list from 100 down to 30. Good move, brother. Thanks. What a feeling. Oh, my God. At any rate. What we are going to see, what this opens us up to in context, is after these electoral midterms, as I said, we've seen the end of Jeff Sessions. We've seen the beginning of Trump's war on law itself and the Constitution, constitutional crisis. We've also seen the end of the Obamacare war and the beginnings of an acceptance of universal socialized medicine. God bless you all. And any one of you who don't want it, just move someplace else. But since everybody's got it in the developed world, you're left with moving to Somalia or some shit. You know, have at it. And you will not be missed. Let's put it that way. What we will see is also a continued fight over immigration. Trump on Friday of last week issued a proclamation designed to sharply restrict the ability of people to seek asylum in the United States. The move is certain to be challenged in court. Administration officials believe the Supreme Court, with its newly strengthened reactionary majority, We'll side with them both on the asylum issue and on a separate case involving their efforts to end the Obama-era DACA program, which shields some 700,000 people from deportation. And that brings us to the conclusion, in this final closing hour, of everything I had to get to tonight. America's problem isn't tribalism, it's racism. What I hinted at in my latest transmission when I brought up our original message that I read out in my latest transmission from J. Moen the First. That was merely but continued with his second message that I read to you tonight. Only one of America's major political parties relies on stoking hatred and fear against those outside its coalition. The Republicans. Trump says he's not racist. That's not how white nationalists see it. Trump cheered Senate victory. So did white supremacists. It's fashionable in the Donald Trump era to decry political tribalism, especially if you're a reactionary attempting to criticize Trump without incurring the wrath of his violent cultists. House Speaker Paul Ryan has lamented the tribalism of American politics. Arizona Senator Jeff Flake, since retired, has said that tribalism is ruining us. Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse has written a book warning that partisan tribalism is statistically higher than at any point since the Civil War, meaning the American War between the states. All of these men are Republicans, all heterosexual white male Republicans at that. In the fallout from Tuesday's midterm elections, many political analysts have concluded that blue America and red America be ever more divided, ever more at each other's throats. But calling this tribalism is entirely misleading, because only one side of this divide remotely resembles a coalition based on ethnic and religious lines. What in sociological terms is deemed ethno-religious identity politics, and only one side has committed itself to a political strategy that relies on stoking hatred and fear of the other. By diagnosing America's problem as tribalism, chin-stroking pundits and their sorrowful semi-Trumpist counterparts in Congress have hidden the actual problem in American politics behind a weird euphemism. In other words, they're obfuscating. It's a smokescreen. Back to Tuesday's midterm elections. In New York's 19th Congressional District, the Democrat Antonio Delgado, a Harvard-educated African-American Rhodes Scholar, defeated the incumbent Republican John Faso in a district that is 84% white, despite Faso caricaturing Delgado as a big city gangster rapper nigga. In Georgia, the Republican Brian Kemp appears to have defeated Democrat Stacey Abrams after using his position as Secretary of State to weaken the power of the black vote in the state and tying his opponent to the new Black Panther Party. We've seen that, of course, a recount's in the works. In Florida, where another recount's in the works that will swing the balance potentially in both these areas, both these states. The Republican Ron DeSantis in Florida defeated the Democrat Andrew Gillum, G-I-L-L-U-M, possibly Gillum in pronunciation. Ron DeSantis, quote-unquote, defeated this Democrat Andrew Gillum after a campaign in which DeSantis' supporters made racist remarks about Gillum. Again, the term nigger being slurred and slung like as much shit you can throw at a wall just to see what sticks. Well, these men are already brown, boys. They aren't going to turn any browner, no matter how much shit you sling. And in the end, maybe they'll come out of that sewer of shit you're slinging smelling like chocolate. The Republican Duncan Hunter, who'll be under indictment by the side, won after running a campaign falsely tying his Democratic opponent, Amar Kapur-Najjar, who is of Latino and Arab descent, to terrorism. All Muslims are terrorists. All Latinos are MS-13 members, even though, you know, most of that's Nicaraguan and not Mexican. I mean, I could go on and on. In North Dakota, Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp lost re-election after Republicans adopted a voter ID law designed specifically to disenfranchise the Native American voters who powered her upset win in 2012. President Trump spent weeks claiming that a caravan of migrants in Latin America headed for the United States poses a grave threat to national security, an assessment the Pentagon itself disagrees with and deconstructs. In Illinois, Tuesday of last week, thousands of Republicans voted for a longtime neo-Nazi who now prefers to describe himself as a white racialist in Virginia. More than 1 million of them cast ballots for a neo-Confederate running for the state. That's in Virginia as opposed to Illinois. Illinois's got the neo-Nazi. Virginia's got the neo-Confederate. Both of them running on that identity on ballot. That's their ticket. And they won. Or many Republicans voted for them, or indeed all white male heterosexuals did. This is the new politics. A large number of Republican candidates, led by the president, running racist or bigoted campaigns against their opponents. But those opponents cannot be said to belong to a tribe. No common ethnic or religious ties bind Heitkamp, Campo-Najjar, Delgado, or the constituencies that elected them. It was their Republican opponents who turned tribalism, turned to it, if you could call it that, painting all of these diverse individuals as scary or dangerous and working to disenfranchise their supporters. The urgency of the Republican strategy stems in part from the recognition that the core of the Republican agenda, slashing the social safety net and reducing taxes on the wealthy, is deeply unpopular. Progressive ballot initiatives, including the expansion of Medicaid, anti-gerrymandering measures, and the restoration of voting rights for formerly incarcerated peoples, succeeded even in red states. If Republicans ran on their policy agenda alone, they would be at severe disadvantage. So they have turned to a destructive politics of white identity, one that seeks a path to power by deliberately dividing the country along racial and sectarian lines. They portray the nation as the birthright of white heterosexual Christians and label the growing populations of those who don't fit that cookie-cutter mold or reject that moral framework, if you could call it moral at all, as dangerous usurpers. The Democratic Party, reliant as it is on a diverse coalition of voters, cannot afford to engage in this kind of politics. There be no blue states where Democrats have sought to make it harder for white men without a college education to vote, even though, in my honest opinion, they should be constrained from doing so. Even though that demographic typically votes Republican, which alone is a sign of treason, because Republican equals Russian. It's synonymous. Democratic candidates did not attack their white male opponents as dangerous because 4 white men carried out deadly acts of right-wing terrorism in the 2 weeks prior to the election. We had a fortnight, 14 nights of absolute terror. Mass murder conducted by white trash pieces of shit. Never once was this used as a weapon against the Republicans when it well should have been, because the Republicans are directly responsible for the mass murder that has taken place in that Halloween of horror. Democratic candidates for statewide office did not appeal to voters in blue states by trashing other parts of the country considered to be conservative, as I now rightly do, tired of the bullshit. Democratic candidates who ran for office did not advertise their willingness to use state violence against groups associated with Republican constituencies. The Republicans can only accuse Antifa, the anti-fascist movement, a scattered movement of some couple hundred people scattered across the nation who don't even exist as a statistical reality, of being their source of fear. Now, even I am not arguing that the Democratic Party or its members are particularly virtuous. A little more than a century ago, 'twas the Republican Party that was reliant on a diverse coalition of voters, and the Democratic Party that rode white rage to power. Rather, I'm saying, at this historical moment in time, this most critical, definitive moment of all human history, that when a party's viability be dependent on a diverse coalition of voters, that party will necessarily stand for pluralism and equal rights because its very survival depends on it. And when a party is not diverse, it will rely on demonizing those who be different, because no constituency exists within that party to prevent it from doing so, or to show its members that they have nothing to fear. In the Trump era, America finds itself with 2 political parties, one that's growing more reliant on the nation's diversity, and one that sees its only path to power, its only path, in stoking fear and rage toward those who be different. America doesn't have a tribalism problem. It has a racism problem. and the parties be no equally responsible. This is darkness and light. This is good and evil. This is Stephen King's The Stand manifest in your lifetime. And the cities of Babylon and Israel be forming in their respective capitals to decide the future of your fucking soul, whether it be damned or whether it be saved. And white supremacists are saying they were the winners in last week's midterm elections. They were already emboldened by the language used by President Donald Trump and senior members of his administration. Words like nationalist and invasion, they have hateful dual meanings, according to a review of sites frequented by white supremacists themselves. And they saw Tuesday's results as a victory for Trump, white supremacists, and white America, with what they believe will be progress towards a border wall, an end to DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy, and ultimately birthright citizenship. Your greatest example for what happens when a nation gets rid of birthright citizenship be the Dominican Republic and their subsequent massacre of Haitian refugees from the other side of the island. We'll go into that next transmission. We don't have time for that in our remaining minutes. Memes and commentary on the neo-Nazi Daily Stormer site bashed non-white candidates who did not win in this Tuesday's midterms, as well as losses by Republicans not seen as Trump loyalists. Now, Daily Stormer founder and publisher Andrew Anglin himself wrote, "This electoral midterms 2018 has changed history. It cleared away any of the remaining fog of confusion about what exactly we are dealing with in this country. This is race war. Period. Kill non-whites. Kill all women who don't submit. Rape all those children who don't want to grow up pure white." Now, what's not clear is if any extremists will follow these words with violence, as happened with Robert Bowers, who has since pleaded not guilty to killing 11 people at a synagogue late last month, allegedly because he believed Jews were helping invaders. Andrew Anglin, the Daily Stormer founder and publisher, was buoyed by the win of Republican Steve King in Iowa, even after King was pilloried for meeting with a far-right Austrian group linked to neo-Nazis and retweeting an avowed Nazi sympathizer. King, a Republican of course, says he was unaware of the Nazi links in both these incidences, but he's used racially charged and anti-immigrant rhetoric for years. And he still won with 50.6%, just a little over half of the vote, in Iowa's deeply reactionary 4th Congressional District. In Illinois, Arthur Jones, a self-declared Holocaust denier and former leader of the American Nazi Party, tallied almost 56,000 votes, more than a quarter of the total, standing for the Republican Party in Illinois' 3rd Congressional District. Steve King won, so wrote Anglin, and I'm quoting him here from the neo-Nazi Daily Stormer site itself. Steve King won if last night was a referendum on Steve King's white nationalism, as the Democrats were trying to frame it, then white nationalism won. On the campaign trail for Senator Ted Cruz, fighting for re-election in Texas, Trump himself declared, "I'm a white nationalist, okay? I'm a white nationalist." He told the crowd we're not supposed to use that word, perhaps because he knew of its overtones of cultural superiority to others. Trump batted away a question about whether his words emboldened other white nationalists, saying the question itself was somehow racist. But he wouldn't clarify when asked about it the day after the election by Yamiche Alcindor of PBS NewsHour, who said of his words, some people saw that as an emboldening of white nationalists, and Trump brushed her off with, "That's such a racist question." So basically he said, "Shut up, you yellow nigger bitch. I'm a white man. And if we were off camera, I would rape your ass." When she followed up with, there be some people that say now the Republican Party is seen as supporting white nationalists because of your rhetoric, he replied, "Oh, I don't believe that. I don't believe that." But others evidently do believe it. A commentator on the 4chan bulletin board joked Trump was winking at them. Earlier, another poster declared Trump was venerated by white supremacists the world over. What Dems, all leftists, and pundits do not understand is that Trump is patriots and Western American heritage's champion. I'm directly quoting them. To Alcindor, Trump repeated 2 more times how racist her questions were, but he also never flatly denounced white supremacists, who were, of course, overjoyed, calling the press conference glorious and beautiful on 4chan, with one commentator writing, "I am honestly in awe of Donald Trump as a leader where he bashed down a colored bitch in front of the world. He slapped that bitch. He cock-slapped her. All he didn't do was throw her on the floor, rip off her clothes, and raped her. If he had done that, I would have orgasmed." Now, Keegan Hanks, a senior research analyst at Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project, observes, "It doesn't take an overt slur for these individuals to basically become emboldened and to recognize and be excited by policies that they see would further their goals. When they hear the president say things like, 'I'm not a racist,' they turn around amongst themselves and say, 'He just says that for practical reasons. He just has to say that basically to get himself cover to do things that we want him to do.' They believe him as their battering ram." That was also the reaction after the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, in August last year, when torch-carrying crowds marched through the streets saying, "Jews will not replace us." And, of course, a breeding-age white woman was killed in a car that was driven into a group of counter-protesters by an Aquino cultist, making a human sacrifice for the anti-gods. And Trump said in remarks about the Unite the White Right rally, "You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides." Now, Hanks, the researcher at Southern Poverty Law Center, says President Trump's response to Charlottesville absolutely, positively, indisputably legitimized these individuals. Well, some language is seen as a dog whistle. Now, I've used that term before. I'm going to define it for you now. I understand a lot of you out there don't understand this lexicon. A dog whistle be a code heard with a special meaning by the like-minded. And while some language of Trump's be seen as a dog whistle, at other times harsh and false terminology from the White House takes over. Trump was combative with reporters the day after the elections, doubling down on his assertion that migrants in Mexico are would-be invaders. At the Wednesday news conference, CNN's Jim Acosta challenged Trump on his description of the caravan of Central American migrants comprising pregnant women and children heading through Mexico towards the United States as an invasion when it obviously be not. But Trump batted away the challenge. "I consider it an invasion," Trump called Acosta, meaning any woman who comes here to squeeze out a bunch of anchor puppies, you got to kill them all. Kill the bitch, kill her puppies. That's how his white boys think. On places like 4chan, false talk of the migrant caravan as invaders has taken over on some of the message boards and become the popular meme topic. In some places, the only meme topic. Analysts have ascertained the browning of America, where whites become a minority, is what the white supremacists fear most. So there be threads with memes containing photos doctored to look like people breaking down walls at the U.S. border with Mexico. There be jokes about how the traditional rush of Black Friday shoppers be nothing compared to what will happen next. In another thread on 4chan, commentators speculate about how many people would be shot if they came over the border. The thread appeared to reference Trump's comment that U.S. troops on the border could fire on someone in the migrant caravan if the person threw rocks or stones. All of them, one poster wrote of a possible casualty count. "Not enough," said another. Before the midterm election, the Daily Stormer site urged followers to vote for their overt and implicit agendas. It featured a flashing image of Donald Trump front and center with the words, "It's happening." There was also a vile meme on the site, which is visited more than 2.5 million times a month, according to data from analytics firm SimilarWeb. A commentator posted a picture of a white man dressed for war with the words, "Us if we win," followed by a "them if we win" on a photo of Jews being led to slaughter at gas chambers during the Holocaust. The administration's approach to immigration in particular has electrified many racists, to the point where they're begging their followers to go out and find ways to put Republicans in office. They believe it'll be easier for these policies to sail through, and these are things that they think are essential for creating a white ethno-state across the continental North American continent. Perhaps this election did energize white nationalists to vote if they thought they had a champion in government, but there be also the fear and the example of men taking matters into their own violent hands. Bowers, the synagogue killer, echoed Trump talking points when he wrote on the Free Speech Gab forum, the free speech forum that's called Gab, which also hosted bellgab.com. That was the site that promoted child pornography, which is why all the pedophiles were attacking me from that site specifically, and I had to get it shut down. And I shut down yet another trading site in pedo porn because I didn't have a choice. They had me balls to the wall and up against the Grand Canyon, and like I do every time, I always wind up the last man standing. And it's from these people at the larger site that hosted bellgab.com, the child porn site, the larger free speech forum Gab, which is why I say we've got to kill free speech. They're stating, I've noticed a change in people saying illegals that now say invaders. And that post was made 6 days before the shooting. That post was entered by Bowers, the synagogue killer himself. And he concluded by saying, I like this. He noticed a change in people saying illegals that now say invaders. He likes it. And that brings us to the hate crimes. Hate crimes are up significantly in the United States throughout last year, according to just released numbers from the FBI. Reported incidents rose 17% yesteryear, 2017, compared to 2016. Of 7,106 single bias hate crimes reported last year, 59.6% of victims were targeted because of the offender's race, ethnicity, ancestry bias. 20.6% were targeted because of sexual orientation bias. 1.9% were targeted because of gender identity bias. And 0.6% were targeted because of gender bias. In other words, because they had a cunt between their legs. Of 1,679 religious hate crimes reported, 58.1% were anti-Jewish, while 18.6% were anti-Muslim. The statistics are a compilation of bias-motivated incidents submitted by the FBI by some 16,000 law enforcement agencies, submitted to the FBI by some 16,000 law enforcement agencies across the United States. I'm just digging them up on the website now. So this is our conclusion. This is the punchline that I've been coming through all this hard struggle that brought us here. It's going to take another 15 minutes. You hang in there because we started off late. We're finishing it off late. It's already close to 10 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So that means it's about 1 a.m. in Canada and on the Atlantic seaboard and in the eastern states. A few more minutes and you can lay your head to rest. Trump celebrated the midterm results, but without millennials and women, he's headed for disaster in 2020. Americans delivered an unmistakable message of disapproval to both Trump and the Republican Party. And Republicans are not listening. Tuesday's midterm elections can be summed up in 4 fucking words. The reckoning has come. An estimated 113 million voters, an impressive 49% of the electorate, since then ascertained to be half, 50%, turned out in numbers closer to the 2016 presidential election than the 2014 midterms. Indeed, this is the highest turnout rate for midterm elections since the 1960s, the decade I myself was delivered into this vale of tears to watch this endless sea of horrors and this circus of madness. With most of the ballots counted so far, it's clear the Democrats resoundingly took control of the House of Representatives, 7 gubernatorial mansions, over 300 state legislative seats, and also added to their ranks in state and local races throughout the country. while Republicans expanded their majority in the Senate, which I said shouldn't even exist at this point in history and was founded in racism and slavery. And of course, the Republicans arguably ended the rural Democratic Party and took over all the fucking bumpkin countryside of ignorant hicks fucking their mothers and their pet dogs. Americans overall delivered an unmistakable message of disapproval to both Donald Trump and the Republican Russian administrative government, the RAG itself. Fueling my judgment, my conclusion, millennials, young voters, and women. Their judgment's not mine. It's the real America's. The America of now and forevermore. Republicans are now left to ask the questions of how and why did this happen. And to quote Shakespeare, "The fault, dear Brutus, be not in our stars, but in ourselves." For several years, Republican leaders were warned of a growing problem. Millennials, the largest generation and portion of the workforce in the United States, who were not connecting at all with the Republican Party. For several years, Republican leaders were warned of a growing problem. Millennials, you've got the largest generation that, unless major changes were made to accommodate them, the party would suffer severe consequences at the ballot box. Because we are entering the third millennium of the Christian calendar. They are the choke point in the hourglass. Republican Party leaders dismissed warnings of the looming demographic millennial crisis, literally an apocalypse, when they were forewarned about how the Women's March could be so dangerous to Republicans in 2018 as the Tea Party was to Democrats in 2010. They ignored that problem too. And it was these demographics, young voters, classified as voters ages 18 through 29 years of age, millennials, people born between 1981 through 1997, and educated women, that delivered big for Democrats across the country during Tuesday's midterm elections. While there be still a great deal of data to come, even now, the preliminary data we had then and everything that's come so far clearly shows that young voters and millennials were particularly impactful. In 2014, just 19.9% of voters aged 18 through 29 years of age, and 26% of Americans under 40 cast their ballots. In the 2018 midterms, an estimated 31% of young voters showed up at the polls, a 55% increase that was nearly double the overall voter turnout increase as a total. Democrats won the youth vote by 35 points, a significant shift from their 11-point margin in 2014. At the same time, Democrats won the overall women's vote, 59 to 40%, a substantially larger margin than the 4 points they won it by in 2014. What powered all this newfound energy of femininity in youth? The most abundant renewable energy source on the planet. Rage. You see, hey, all you white trash, ignorant motherfucking pieces of shit, all you heterosexual male human nothings, all you human zeros who have a cock between your legs, you're not the only motherfuckers who can get angry. You're not the only motherfuckers who can rage. Anger and rage can fuel anybody, including women and kids. The actions, or rather the inactions of the Republican Party to mitigate this surge were abysmal. The party's attitude toward avoiding criminality and calamity was akin to an airline pilot playing a game of chicken with a mountain. They dismissed millennials and young voters using two flawed arguments. They don't vote, and when they ultimately do, they will have become reactionary because they have quote-unquote responsibilities, like having a job and paying taxes. However, there were multiple signs that millennials and young voters in particular were going to vote this year. Poll after poll showed an increase in enthusiasm among this sector of the electorate, and voter registration data saw a significant uptick in registration. As for the claim that millennials will vote Republican as they age and assume responsibilities such as having jobs and paying taxes, it is, as everything else, a white trash heterosexual male will tell you whatever he needs to tell you to get you to swallow a date rape drug. In other words, it's whatever he can get you to swallow before he forces his cock in your mouth and makes you swallow his sperm, before he ties you up and makes you swallow his sputum. It's rape. It's mind rape. It's data rape. It's rape on truth. It's an assault on reality. It's bullshit. The oldest millennials are now 37, have jobs, pay taxes, and are busy worrying about how to pay for their kids' college educations. And they themselves likely faced or still face massive student debt, which only heightens these concerns. Despite being marginally older, they still feel that the Republican Party does not represent them or their values, so they continue to support the Democratic candidates who do. And making matters worse, the Republican Party actually does believe that the way to win over millennials is to promote figures like Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, and Tommy Lahren, who are the baby boomers' idea of a millennial Republican. Each of these demagogues believe that the best way to expand the Republican Party is to shamelessly promote themselves while owning the libs. In the process, pushing the kinds of divisive rhetoric and ideas that make millennials turn away from the Republican Party in the first place. Even many millennial Republicans find their antics and 280 character at a time tweet level discussion there, right-wing Twitter infomercials, they find them to be intellectually lacking and outright vacuous. Continuing to rely on these soapbox orators, these tin pot dictators, these Huey Longs of the greater American swamp of the mind, and their obtuse drivel to bring millennials and young Americans to the Republican Party will continue to lead to the opposite effect. Instead, these dunces should be cast out in favor of more thoughtful conservatives who have proven they can speak to and work with audiences other than the Republican fucking base of people who fuck their dogs and their siblings. And while it's too early to tell, even now, if Tuesday's results are indicative of a durable long-term shift of the electorate, which I conclude they be, it certainly makes clear that the Republican Party has a significant amount of work to do when it comes to women and millennial voters, and they're not doing it. So based on comments already made by President Donald Trump and the Republican leaders he rules as a religious cult, the prospect of a course correction looks impossible. Instead, it's obvious that the strategy is to become even Trumpier, which the American people, particularly women and the millennials, have already made clear is not their cup of teabaggery. Although Trump celebrated the outcome of the midterms as an election he won, he's headed for another electoral disaster in 2020. And when that happens, Republican leaders will have only themselves to blame. That's tonight. We end at 10 after 10. I love you all. Return on the weekend for another beating. And I invite my comrades and ours to come on now and take over the stage, as my voice is worn and ragged. At this point, I feel like I've been gargling with broken glass. Okay. Y'all can come on now. Oh, please. Oh, okay. Okay, we can't hear Paul, which is sad. He has a lot to say. Yeah. That's fine. And we did record. Yeah, we're stopping the stream. All right, everybody. My farewells unto all, and to everyone. Thank you so much for sticking it out tonight. I know it was a rough ride. It was a lot like kayaking in the rapids, but we made it, and we made it out alive and in one piece. God bless you all. Death and torture to my detractors and my gang stalkers, which is what they wished on me and mine. Be well, otherwise, the rest of you, the human beings.